I hope that you all passed a very pleasant evening. For myself personally, yesterday was really a very stimulating and exciting day. I really find that this seminar is so precious because it's really an opportunity for a chance to really exchange ideas with people from so many different parts of the world, and particularly. So there's no sound? Can you hear me? Okay.
Now better.
Can you hear? Is it better now?
Yes.
Particularly, I think that this is a very precious opportunity for exchange let's say, between Europe and Africa and the United States and Latin America. So many different ideas and experiences to be able to share together. So in that respect, I really view this very much for myself as a learning experience. Yesterday, our fundamental focus was with Marxism per se, and Mr. William Lay, in all four of the lectures which he presented to us yesterday, in a very concise and clear fashion, actually covered the very essence of Marxist theory. Today, what we're going to begin to touch upon in this lecture is, we can say, a further development of Marxism, which is, of course, that ingredient of Lenin. According to many social scientists, it is argued that perhaps without a man such as Marx, such as Lenin, Marx might be just another social thinker, the same as Fourier or Owen or Saint-Simon. A social thinker whom we might be able to read in a large municipal library which happens to have a section on social thinkers. But because of Lenin, Marxism is something which is very much alive and which has been able to reach millions and millions of people. Today, approximately 39% of the world's territory and 42% of the world's population is controlled by communism. And essentially, it's because of the Leninist ingredient. So this morning we want to at least touch on some of the basic elements and concepts of Leninism. Lights, please. The first lecture this morning, therefore, is referred to as Imperialism and the Third International. At universities throughout the Third World, we don't often hear too much reference to the labor theory of value. We don't often hear too much reference to dialectical materialism or even to Marx's view of history. But what we do hear very often are accusations concerning imperialism and the tremendous dangers of imperialism. Even imperialism is presented as, by the left, as being a very coherent ideology. This is a study of Donald Duck, maintaining that all of the Donald Duck stories actually have one purpose, and that is to promote American imperialism. So let's talk a little bit about how exactly imperialist theories developed. With the death of Marx in 1883 and the subsequent death of Engels in 1895, the communist, or as it was called then, social democratic world, was in search of a guide or a mentor, someone who would be able to really interpret Marx. And the likely candidate for that position was Edward Bernstein. Bernstein, who was German, was a convert to Marxism after he had studied Anti-Düring of Friedrich Engels. And he spent quite a bit of time with Engels himself and had a very broad and deep understanding of Marx's theories. However, Bernstein was particularly concerned with some of Marx's economic principles. Marx was quite certain that capitalism was destined to fall. And the reason that he had that certainty was because he had discovered three laws which existed within capitalist society. The first of those laws was the principle of the centralization of capital. Marx said that because inherently capitalists were ruthless, selfish, thinking only about their own well-being, that they would have a tendency literally to do anything to win over their competition. Dumping, price fixing, any process or means in order to be able to become victorious in their particular area or field. Secondly, as we saw yesterday in Mr. Lay's lecture, Marx maintained that the only source of profit within any enterprise came from workers. Therefore, Marx maintained that it was completely impossible for a machine to produce profits. But all around him, what he saw, in fact, was that there was more and more automation. Therefore, he concluded that because there was more automation, there would be less workers. And because there would be less workers, there would naturally, therefore, be less profit. Likewise, machines would replace workers, meaning more and more unemployment. In other words, an increase of poverty. These three principles, Marx said, indicated very clearly what was going to happen. More and more, the target would be clear, that a handful of people had all of the wealth, and that they were able to maintain their wealth and power because of exploiting the workers. The workers, therefore, would progressively awaken and understand that they had been exploited, and the efforts that they had made in order to help an industry to advance, those efforts had helped to buy machinery, and that machinery had been responsible for them finally losing their jobs. Therefore, who had they worked for? Well, not for themselves, because they'd been paid in the most minimal way. Finally, they'd worked for just a handful of ruthless capitalists. And ultimately, they would recognize that this was their true enemy. Therefore, they would unite together, and they would finally overthrow the system which oppressed them. And likewise, they would ultimately kill the capitalists. Now, Bernstein saw a different series of phenomena which were occurring inside of the capitalist society. He noted that at the end of the 19th century, things were happening which Marx had not predicted. Profits were not decreasing, they were actually increasing. And likewise, there was not an increase of poverty. In fact, the living conditions of the worker were improving. And so, Bernstein wrote a book entitled Evolutionary Socialism. He said that after his extensive study of Marxism, he'd come to conclude that Marx's supposedly scientific predictions about the destiny of capitalist society were in fact inaccurate. He said, therefore, that Marx was not a scientist. It was possible to respect the good intentions of Marx. Certainly that was true. However, we could no longer just take literally every step which Marx proposed and say that that was scientifically destined to happen. Instead, Engels said we should respect the intentions of Marx. However, Bernstein said we should respect the intentions of Marx. However, there was no scientific necessity for a violent revolution. He maintained that it would be possible through the democratic process to improve the situation of the workers, and that no revolution would be necessary. And when Bernstein's ideas spread throughout the social democratic or communist world, as it is known today, it came to be rather popular. However, one book emerged which very strongly challenged Bernstein's idea, and that was Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, in many ways, we can say, is the St. Paul of communism. During his life, Christ brought a very precious message. However, it was a methodology which was established after Christ's death by St. Paul, which allowed Christianity to spread all throughout the world. And the same can be said about Lenin. The methodology which was developed by Lenin is the methodology which is responsible for communism spreading all around the globe. Now let's just talk very briefly about the evolution of communism. There were essentially four, but I'm only going to speak about three different efforts to coordinate communist activities or worker activities. The first effort was the First International, which lasted from approximately 1868 till 1876-77. And the leader of the First International was Karl Marx himself. Now, the First International was not made up just of adherents to Marxist theory. Instead, besides adherents to Marxist theory, there were all different types of groups, at least four groups, who were militating for workers' rights. And Marxism was actually a minority position. Marx, however, successively came to have more and more influence in the First International. But as he came to have more and more influence, there were a lot of personality conflicts within the First International, and finally, it broke apart. The Second International was headed by Edward Bernstein. Also, we can speak about Karl Kautsky. And it had a more liberal interpretation of Marxism. It felt that Marxism had to be related to the particular conditions of any given country. It was impossible to say, well, this, and this must be fulfilled in any given nation for that nation to be successful. It rejected that concept and said that Marxism had to develop in accord with the particular idiosyncrasies of a given nation. Essentially, there are different factors which are responsible for the dissolution of the Second International. Also, there are different dates. Here I have 1903. Some people go as far as 1914. And disputes were centering around things such as, what is a member of the Communist Party? As I said, Bernstein and Kautsky had a very loose concept. Individuals that had a basic identification with the workers' situation could be viewed as members of the Communist Party. Lenin, on the other hand, wanted to have a very disciplined core of individuals who would be responsible for guiding communism forward. Lenin's ideas, we can say, became canonized in 1919 through the Third International. And let's just discuss a few of Lenin's basic ideas before we go into the basic part of the lecture today, which deals with imperialism. First of all, Lenin himself is a very unique individual. By the age of 16 or 17, essentially, he had mastered much of Marxist theory. By the age of 24, he was the only individual inside of Russia who had contact with all of the various communist cells. Lenin developed a methodology, and that methodology centered around certain concepts which he developed from his own experience. Yesterday, William Ley, for example, spoke about the concept of the proletariat. People such as Karl Kautsky said that it was not the mission of the communist or the social democrat, it was not his mission to revolutionize or to provoke revolution. It was the responsibility of the communists to be revolutionary and to await the day when finally the workers by themselves would automatically be awakened into a revolutionary consciousness. However, Lenin came to the conclusion that that day would never come. He concluded that the only way that the worker could be motivated or stimulated to the point where he would opt for revolution would be if he were to be educated. And the way to do so, therefore, according to Lenin, was to form a revolutionary vanguard. A group of intellectuals, a group of people who understood Marxist theory and who committed themselves to communicating that theory to others. In his text, State and Revolution, which was written in July 1917, shortly before the takeover of Russia, Lenin there devised or spoke of the ways in which a state, once it has been communized, should be directed or led. He spoke about the need, for example, of a very strong security force. During the whole process, as communism went from the transitional stage of socialism towards true communism. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is a text which has had tremendous implications for the whole world. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, first of all, is a categorical refutation of the principles and plans which were made by Bernstein. Lenin proceeds to defend Marx's laws of economic movement. First of all, he affirms that a centralization of capital is occurring in exactly the way that Marx predicted. In his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he gives examples of corporations such as General Electric. And he says, what are you talking about? In 1900, General Electric controlled 50% of the world market in electricity. In 1905, they controlled 55%. In 1910, they controlled 60%. He cites the case of the Rhine-Westphalen Coal Company in Germany and shows exactly the same phenomenon. 1900, 40% of the market. 1905, 50%. 1910, 60%. He gives a number of cases to prove that the centralization of capital is occurring exactly as Marx predicted. But then Lenin had to explain, why was it not that a decrease of profits occurred, and why was there not an increase of poverty? To that, Lenin had a very interesting response. He spoke about a new alliance, an alliance between entrepreneurs and bank financiers. That these two together had united, and they had found a strategy to keep in power and also to quiet the workers of the developed world. That strategy revolved around an exportation of capital to the third world. Now, essentially, through imperialism, what could be accomplished by this new strategy was that, for example, instead of lending money in France at, let's say, an interest rate of 25%, they could lend that same money in Africa at an interest rate of maybe 35%. And not only that, the capitalists would be able, through this unity with the bank financiers, not just to lend the money, but to even tell the people of those countries how they had to spend that money. So if, for example, there would be a unity between, let's say, the Chase Manhattan Bank and the Ford Motor Company, they might go to Brazil. And going to Brazil, they would say, we will lend you $3 million at 40% interest, and with that money, you will be able to buy Fords. Nothing else, but you will be able to buy Fords. Now, the same automobile might be sold in the United States at $10,000, but it would be sold in Brazil for $15,000. Essentially, therefore, the capitalists were able to make a killing in two ways, according to Lenin. By exorbitant interest rates, and likewise, they would be able to charge exorbitant prices. And furthermore, it would be a good way, when people couldn't pay in cash, to get very inexpensive raw materials from these third world nations. Lenin concluded that the third world had been divided into colonized spheres of control, financial control, essentially. This was the motivating factor. Portugal had its section of the world, France had its section of the world, Britain had its section of the world, the United States had its section of the world, and this was the way in which they were able to continue to survive. Furthermore, Lenin came to the conclusion, the workers of the developed world, we cannot win them. We cannot win the workers of the developed world so long as imperialism continues to exist. Because so long as there is imperialism, the reality is that the workers of the developed world are going to be able to be, we can say, bribed. In other words, for example, yesterday, Mr. William Lay gave us the example of the gentleman who was receiving $2 for each shirt that he made. So what they'll do now is give that gentleman a little bit more money. Because of the incredible profits that are coming from the third world, they can now afford to pay this worker $3 or $4. Still, they're exploiting this worker, but not as severely as before. Then the worker will have the funds to buy himself a nice home in the suburbs, to have his color television, and he's going to completely ignore his situation of exploitation, and there will be no solidarity amongst the world's working force. Lenin concludes, therefore, that the Third World has been colonized for the economic survival of Europe and the United States. There's only one way to turn around this situation, Lenin says. And the way to turn around this situation is that it is absolutely essential to cut the Third World markets of the developed world. They must be cut. And so, therefore, Lenin advocates self-determination for all people, an end to colonialism. In modern-day Leninism, we speak not just about political colonialism, but also economic colonialism as well. And the way that this can be accomplished, the way to realize self-determination, is by promoting wars of national liberation. Through these wars of national liberation, it will be possible to cut off the markets of the developed world. It's interesting to note that in all of the recent revolutions, when we talk about Vietnam, in Vietnam there was a National Liberation Front. In Nicaragua, it was the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. In El Salvador today, it's the Marabundi Front for National Liberation. Likewise, Castro's movement was a movement for national liberation. This term is right away a sign that behind that movement is Leninist philosophy. And the war for national liberation has been able to inspire many young people. They've been filled with idealism and hope, believing that through national liberation, they will finally be able to determine their own destinies. Thousands, and we can say millions of lives have been sacrificed for the cause of national liberation. And therefore, we have to really ask whether or not Lenin's position is valid. So we want to do a critique of Lenin's view of imperialism. First of all, as we saw, Lenin affirmed Marx's three laws of economic development. Now, concerning the centralization of capital, it's interesting to see that in the developed world, there's not a centralization of capital which has occurred, but instead a distribution of capital, in fact. If we take large companies, for example, General Electric does not have 1 or 2 or 3 owners. In fact, it has 3 million owners, 3 million shareholders. And many of those shareholders are actually workers who, because of working a certain number of years, they receive a certain number of shares of stock in General Electric. Chase Manhattan has approximately 7 million shareholders. So in fact, to say that there's been a centralization of capital in the developed world is not accurate. In fact, what we find is a distribution of capital. Furthermore, it's interesting to see that Marx spoke about a process of dumping, a process of price fixing, etc., which would be responsible for the centralization of capital. Nevertheless, even before Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, in 1914 the Clayton Antitrust Act was realized in the United States to begin to curtail that kind of action. Even before that, we find legislation which was realized in Europe with the same purpose. Let's talk a little bit then about the bribery of workers of the developed world. Centralization of capital is not valid. But is it true that workers were being bribed in the developed world from what was occurring through an exportation of capital? It's interesting to consider the living conditions of the French worker at the turn of the century, France, a nation which had many colonies, and compare those living conditions with the living conditions of the Scandinavian worker at the turn of the century. Scandinavia, which had very few colonies and also very little dealings with the Third World at that time. In fact, the living conditions of the Swedish worker were better than those of the French worker. Now, how could that be possible if imperialism was wholly responsible for the survival of the workers in the developed world and for the survival of capitalism? It's important to point out here that Lenin spoke about a cornerstone to Marxist economics. And for Lenin, the cornerstone of Marxist economics was related to the theory of surplus value. As William Ley mentioned yesterday, Engels saw this as one of the two principal points of Marx's discoveries, the theory of surplus value. Now, the theory of surplus value was responsible for the whole development of Marx's laws of economic movement, as we saw. The theory of surplus value, saying machines cannot generate profit, was the basis for Marx's three laws. And those three laws were defended through Lenin's theory of imperialism. However, we saw yesterday from Mr. Ley that in fact machines do have the power to produce profit. And because machines have the power to produce profit and not only workers, this destroys the Marxist theory of surplus value. If the theory of surplus value is not valid, then likewise, Marx's laws of economic development cannot be valid because they are based on the theory of surplus value. And therefore, the whole of Lenin's theory of imperialism, which is based upon these two false theses, breaks in two. Let's talk about national liberation. In his book, Les Cubains en Afrique, The Cubans in Africa, Ezzeddin Mestiri says that initially, when the Cubans became involved in Africa, one might think that actually their intentions were very noble. One might think, for example, that in Angola they genuinely wanted to help the Angolan people be freed from Portuguese imperialism. Or one might say the same thing about Mozambique. But Mestiri says we can understand the true intentions of the Soviet-Cuban involvement inside of Africa if we take the case of Somalia. In 1960, Somalia received its independence. Prior to 1960, Somalia had been controlled by Great Britain, Italy, and Ethiopia. Now, Britain and Italy gave independence to Somalia. However, Ethiopia decided that they wanted to keep Ogaden. Ogaden is a part of Somalia. The people there are culturally Somali. They speak the same language, they have the same heritage, etc. However, Haile Selassie determined that he wanted to keep Ogaden. In 1974, Somalia became a communist country. And when Somalia became a communist country, they petitioned to the Soviet Union to help them in their efforts to liberate Ogaden. The Soviet Union sent supplies, and the Cubans sent 5,000 Cuban troops to help the liberation of Ogaden. Nevertheless, at the same time, interesting events began to occur within Ethiopia. Because in 1975, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown, and for about 2 years there was a lot of political confusion within Ethiopia. But in 1977, finally, the new president, Mengistu, proclaimed himself a Marxist-Leninist. At that time, he went to the Soviet Union, and he said, could you please help us? Help us to keep Ogaden, because the Somalis are trying to take Ogaden away from us. Now, the Soviets had to make a choice. Were they going to help Somalia, or were they going to help Ethiopia? They already had 5,000 troops within Somalia, so what were they going to do? Ethiopia had a population of 30 million people. Somalia had a population of only 4 million people. And so the Soviet Union, being very practical, in May 1978, the troops which had been in Somalia ended up in Ethiopia. And they began to defend the Ethiopian occupation of Ogaden. In the principles of the Soviet Communist Party, we find the following words. The nationalism of an oppressed nation contains a general democratic element, and communists support it because they consider it historically justified at a given stage. Historically justified at a given stage. This is the key. National liberation is historically justified at a given stage. What is the given stage? The given stage is prior to the Soviet takeover of that country. When Afghans fight for national liberation, they are reactionaries. They're reactionaries because it's no longer historically justified. Afghanistan is now controlled by the Soviet Union. So instead of talking about national liberation, what we actually should speak about is national Sovietization. Prior to the takeover of Russia by Lenin, we find many beautiful words and promises, particularly in 1916. If we study the works of Lenin in 1916, just prior to the takeover, there are many beautiful promises. Lenin says, for example, no nation can be free if it oppresses another nation. Likewise, he says, all those who back the right of nations to self-determination must stand for the right of the Ukraine to secede from Russia. Likewise, he warns about a danger of Tsarist Russia, that Tsarist Russia intends to invade Afghanistan. Likewise, he says, the Russian people do not want to become Poland's oppressor again. It's interesting that all the things that Lenin said are today completely shown to be occurring. Let's consider the development of Russia since the Russian Revolution. This was Soviet Russia in 1917. Lenin had promised the independence of all the colonies. However, beginning in 1919, we notice a process, and that is that Lenin begins to recover the whole of the former Tsarist empire. He's able to realize this by 1922. And this process continues. On until today. The Soviets have criticized imperialism, but what is the situation of those nations which have been Sovietized? Let's take the case of Angola. As I mentioned yesterday evening, since the takeover of Angola by the Soviets through their Cuban proxies, 1 million of the 6 million population has been forced to flee the nation. 150,000 have been killed. The Soviets wanted to liberate them from the oppression of imperialists. Nevertheless, it's interesting to note that Angola has become one of the major sources of coffee for the Soviet Union. However, instead of paying the world coffee market price, the Soviet Union pays to Angola 38% of the world coffee market price. Likewise, they pay only 50% of the standard world market price for natural gas to Afghanistan. One of the nations which received supposedly a lot of, quote, Soviet aid is India. It's interesting to consider the situation of India because India today has a tremendous debt to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union lent money, and that money had to be used to buy Soviet material in order to build certain types of plants, different types of industrial plants, such as steel-producing plants. Now, it's interesting to consider the situation of those plants, because the Soviets made certain principles with the Indian government. First of all, they demanded that those industries had to be led permanently by Soviets, not by Indian people, but by Soviets. Likewise, they demanded that the Indian government would pay all medical, all health, all vacation benefits, and all expenses for the travel of these Soviet officials between India and the Soviet Union. Of the principle that was lent to the Indian government by the Soviet Union, 20% of the principle is used in order to finance the particular needs of these Soviet officials. All in all, it was recently calculated in the Indian Economic Review that the Indian government is going to be obliged to pay back to the Soviet Union 560% of the principal that was lent to them. In the case of Eastern Europe between 1957 and 1973, the Soviet Union took out $19 billion in illegal profit. Constantly, the United States and other nations of the West are criticized for imperialism. And the reason they are imperialist, even if, for example, if we take the case of France, France was defined by Lenin as being an imperialist nation in 1916. In 1916, less than 10% of France's foreign investments were in the Third World. They are imperialist. Why? Because by definition, and according with Lenin's terms, these nations are imperialist. But for a moment now, let's take Lenin's definitions of imperialism and let's apply them to the Soviet Union. Lenin spoke about the danger of social imperialism. What is social imperialism? Lenin said that social imperialism applied to those individuals who are socialist in words and imperialist in deeds. Marx predicted that capitalism would naturally gravitate towards state monopoly capitalism. Now, the point that Marx makes, and also Lenin makes, is that state monopoly capitalism is not socialism. It's not socialism because of what? Because we must ask one question. The question is, who is the state monopoly industry serving? If it's still serving a handful of individuals, it's capitalism. It's a way for a handful of people to benefit and to live well at the expense of others. And so who is the Soviet economy serving? Can we say that it's serving the workers? Well, we all know the situation of Poland, a situation where supposedly people are being served by, the workers are being served, and what's the reality? The workers are revolting. And the situation of the Soviet workers is even more miserable. As William Ley mentioned yesterday, the wages which are received in the Soviet Union by month are less than the wages needed for subsistence. In a recent book which appeared in France, and this is just one page of the book, and it goes on page after page, when a group of Soviet workers tried to organize a union, within just a few months after making that effort, about 33% of them ended up in psychiatric hospitals. So, it's just one page of it, you know. Staying prisoner, detained in psychiatric hospital, stayed in psychiatric hospital, attempt at psychiatric internment. Page after page, it's the same thing. And what is the living condition of the Soviet worker? The average Soviet housewife spends 30 hours a week standing in lines, trying to get the basic food which is necessary. 30 hours a week. There's a joke about that, actually. It concerns a woman who was waiting maybe 2 or 3 hours to get some meat. And she became extremely frustrated because it wasn't just a one-day thing. It was something day in and day out, day after day after day. And she became so frustrated with waiting in the line that suddenly she got up and she ran. And her friend who was standing right behind her in the line said, "Where are you going? You can get some meat. Let's just wait for a while." And she said, "I can't stand it anymore. I just have to get out of here." And her friend said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to go and kill Andropov." She just ran off. And her friend just waited very patiently in the line for a couple of hours and finally was able to get a kilo of meat. And she was coming out of the store. And when she came out of the store and she looked at the line, who was standing in the line? But her friend was in the line again. And she said, "What are you doing in the line? You told me you were going to go and kill Andropov." And she said, "Well, I was going to kill Andropov, but the line to kill Andropov is bigger than the line for the meat." Anyway, the conclusion is that the Soviet society is not a workers' society. It's not helping the workers. Who is it helping then? In his book, La Nomenklatura, former Soviet official Michael Kozlensky points out that in the Soviet Union today, there is a tiny elite. That tiny elite has the ability to avail themselves of all kinds of important things. They have access to foreign exchange privileges. They have special shops where they can buy the most recent products from Paris and New York. The books that they write are assured of publication royalties, sometimes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is a picture of Brezhnev with his racehorse. In 1980, the official magazine Moscow News proclaimed, yes, one can become a millionaire in Soviet Russia. Supposedly, the Soviet Union has 13,000 millionaires. These individuals are part of the Soviet nomenclatura. In the Soviet Union, they have so-called genius schools. Interestingly, about 90% of the students that are in the genius schools are the sons and daughters of members of the Soviet leadership, because only they can afford to pay the money to have their children educated to pass the tests to get into those schools. 80% of the students in the Soviet military academy are likewise the sons of Soviet military officers. 80% of the students at the prestigious Institute for Foreign Relations in Moscow likewise are the sons and daughters of Soviet officials. As Zinoviev points out in his book, Communisme comme une réalité, what we find in the Soviet Union is just another form of ruthless capitalism. And the nomenclatura is not something which just exists in the Soviet Union. But it seems that every country where communism comes to power, we find the same type of situation with a ruling class of people. Shortly after the communist takeover of Cuba, the same villas where before Americans used to live, Russians began to live. Likewise, the leadership around Castro began to take advantage of all of the luxuries which before belonged to the elite Batista ruling group. In a recent article which appeared in a Costa Rican newspaper, it spoke about the situation today in Nicaragua. Essentially, in Nicaragua today, all of the power is in the hands of approximately 8 families. Exactly as it was before the Sandinista revolution. The coordinator of the Sandinista junta is the brother of the Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense is the brother-in-law of the Minister of the Interior. It's amazing, but they're all tied together, and essentially there's just 8 families which control everything. Likewise, it's interesting to note, this was pointed out by Freedom House magazine, that today the leadership of the Sandinista government are living in the Las Colinas neighborhood, the same neighborhood which was occupied before by the Somocistas. The favorite car, according to Freedom House, of the Sandinista leaders is the Mercedes-Benz. And recently, one of the leaders of the Sandinista junta was seen in Somoza's yacht. In the case of the Soviet Union, then, in the case of communism in general, there has not been an elimination of class. There is clearly a new ruling class, a new group of masters. And so, if we really evaluate the critique that was made in 1916 of the Social Democratic Party of Germany by Lenin, Lenin said that the Social Democratic Party of Germany was socialist in words and imperialist in deeds. If we apply that to the Soviet Union today, the Soviet Union today is clearly socialist in their words, but imperialist in their deeds. Let's draw the conclusion. Marx predicted a concentration of capital in the West. However, as we've seen, the concentration of capital has not occurred in the West fundamentally, but has occurred in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, there seems to be only one corporation, Communist Party Incorporated. Essentially, the leadership of the Communist Party controls everything. The Soviet Union speaks about Lenin speaks about a decrease in profits, that this was going to occur in the West. And although we've had our recessions and our ups and downs, it's manifestly clear that the most disastrous situation every year, the growth rate of the Soviet economy decreases step by step. And as William Ley mentioned yesterday, oftentimes the Soviets play around with their figures to somehow suggest that they're continuing to have tremendous economic success. In his book, Analysis of a Spectre, French Sovietologist Alain Besançon asked questions about some of the Soviet figures. For example, the Soviets always proclaimed, "We are the #1 steel producer in the entire world." Supposedly they produce 145 million tons of steel a year. Now, that quantity of steel is equivalent to the joint output of Japan and Germany, which together manufacture, among other things, 12 million cars. The Soviet Union, however, produces less automobiles per year than Spain. It has a slightly larger railway system than India. It has fewer paved and developed highways than France. And even if we consider the Soviet weaponry, the tanks can only account for a few million tons of the steel that the Soviet Union supposedly produces. So Besançon asked himself the question, well, what accounts for this 145 million tons of steel? Where is it all going to? Or how is it being produced? And finally, he finds this way to explain the figure of 145 million tons. He says that this 145 million tons includes, first of all, the production of actual steel. Secondly, it also includes the production of inferior steel. Thirdly, the 145 million tons must include the production of reject steel. Fourthly, it must include the production of steel for rust. Fifthly, he says it must include the production of pseudo-steel. And sixthly, he says it must also include the pseudo-production of steel. So it's actually in the Soviet Union where we find this situation as well. Let's talk about, likewise, the growth of poverty. The growth of poverty was predicted to occur in the West, but the same thing is true once again. The real situation where there is an increase in poverty is the Soviet Union. If we consider the situation of the Soviet Union, as Colonel Park mentioned in his opening address, in the past 20 years, the infant mortality rate in the Soviet Union has more than doubled. Still today in the Soviet Union, there are children which die, a large number of the children which die. They die due to rickets, a disease which is unknown in the West for 30 years already. But still we find this kind of situation which is existing inside of the Soviet Union. There's a joke about Soviet prosperity as well. It concerns a woman who left the Soviet Union when she was only 16 years old. And after that, she lived in various parts of the world. And after 50 years, like many other people, she had a longing to return home one more time, to visit her family, to see her friends again. So after 50 years, she returned home. And when she returned home, coincidentally, she arrived exactly at the time of her high school reunion. Now, when she was growing up in high school, she had a boyfriend. And they hadn't seen each other for this whole 50 years. And so people began to wonder, I wonder if after 50 years, she'll be able to recognize her old boyfriend. And so, when the high school reunion occurred, the woman came into the large salon where this reunion was occurring, and she saw a little bald-headed man seated over in a corner, and she immediately rushed to this man, and she kissed him on the forehead. And everybody was completely flabbergasted. They said, well, that's completely amazing. How do you explain that? 50 years. After 50 years, how could you possibly recognize your old boyfriend? She said, well, for me it wasn't any problem. I remembered his coat. There's a lot more stories to tell. No time. It's in the Soviet Union where we find a concentration of capital, a decrease of profits, and an increase of poverty. According to Lenin, because of these factors would be the cause for Western imperialism. And Western imperialism would be realized through an exportation of capital. But yet these very factors are the factors which are today the cause for Soviet imperialism. And Soviet imperialism is not just a matter of an exportation of capital, but far more important, it's an exportation of revolution. Every single day, the Soviet Union gives $11 million to Cuba. It doesn't give it for sugar. It gives those $11 million for men. There are 50,000 to 60,000 troops today throughout Africa. There are at least 6,000 Cuban advisors in Nicaragua. Already 10,000 Cuban soldiers have died in Africa in advancing the cause of so-called national liberation or national Sovietization. So many deaths. Deaths without justification in the name of national liberation. And who has this benefited? Can we say that it's benefited the common people? In his text, The Corruption in the Soviet Union by Ilya Zemstov, Zemstov points out that even today, in many sectors of the Soviet Union, there are people that don't have electricity. There are people that have never had an opportunity to go to school. There are people that are living in miserable situations. He served, and I mentioned him yesterday, as an official in Azerbaijan. And he gives an example of just one case that came across his desk. He says that there are many such cases. I'd like to quote from him. On the 13th of February, 1970, a resident of Kirovova, a Mrs. Rubava Gusyanova, 42 years of age, with a primary school education, a divorcee with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, covered herself with oil and burned herself alive. She had lived for 13 years in a cave and had asked the city's executive committee 19 times to find her a dwelling place. This, the 20th time, she chose a different direction. She left a letter on which could be read the words, "This time they will give us one." National liberation, to liberate who? For the well-being of who? For the well-being of a tiny elite Politburo. A new capitalism, a new exploitation is what we find in the Soviet Union as a reality. The West has injustice. There are all kinds of corruption. We can't deny those things, that they exist. However, Marx, Engels, and Lenin maintained that those things had to exist. And this position, Causa rejects. The cause of those things are selfishness. And selfishness cannot be eliminated by a change of systems. The proof of this is the fact that the Soviet system maybe has changed a few structures, but it most certainly has not eliminated selfishness. In order to be successful in really responding to the problems that exist in our world, we need a fundamental moral revolution. We want to speak some more about that afterwards. Thank you very much. Of the real situation in the West today, and also to try to do so in an historical perspective. So in fact, what this lecture will attempt to do is precisely that. Kind of to weigh things in the West as they are now, and to ask ourselves why, and also recognize the challenges which are ahead for us. Lights, please. So this lecture is referred to as Confusion in the Western Value System. From an external viewpoint, we recognize that there's an incredible level of development in the West. We've been able to do all kinds of amazing things over the past few decades. However, from a level of, from a moral viewpoint, we recognize that we confront very real problems, such as crime, crimes against racism, extreme poverty, and even among the most wealthy, we find incredibly difficult to explain situations. In a recent article in Life magazine, it spoke about the case of the United States, that every year in the United States, there are about 1 million teenage runaways between the ages of 11 and 16. By the end of each year, about 5,000 of those 1 million end up in unmarked graves. Another 50,000 of them are never heard of again. Drug problems, etc., become rampant. This century has even seen the assassination of a number of important leaders. Supposedly, however, our society is a Christian society, and all of us are aware of the ideal of the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. On earth as it is in heaven. And in the 20th century, we've seen that there have been several sincere efforts to realize those ideals, or to remind us again of those ideals. For example, Vatican II speaks about the option for the poor, the need for Christian society to appraise and to see what is the Christian society's role towards the poor. We find the development throughout Latin America what are referred to as base communities, which also likewise call for an option to the poor. And as William Lay mentioned yesterday, even in a sense, we can say that communism is kind of a distorted expression of the ideal of the kingdom of God on earth. Nevertheless, the reality is that there is no ideal society, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the way to build a moral and ethical world? Quite essentially, it's the viewpoint of Causa that a moral and ethical world has as its base, as Colonel Fox mentioned yesterday, individuals. And within every individual, there are two dimensions. There's a material and a spiritual dimension, and supposedly there should be a kind of harmony which exists between those two. However, the historical reality is something quite different from that. St. Paul speaks a little bit of the dilemma. He says, "For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin which dwells in my members." In other words, it seems that many times material needs and spiritual or intangible desires are in contradiction within the human being. It really takes an effort many times for people to be able to accomplish certain things. And the great people in history are generally those who are able to establish a kind of balance between their material needs and their ideals, and not just a constant conflict. This projection, this situation which exists in man, for example, frankly, it's not so easy, I'm sure, for all of us to come to these lectures. I know it's not easy for me to come to this lecture particularly. And for all of you as well, it's not easy to come. It takes sacrifice. But if we feel that maybe by understanding each other better, that can help to accomplish some given purpose, well, we're ready to make sacrifices in many different ways or means to accomplish something. The fact-finding tour has a very rigorous schedule. However, if through that we can really get to the bottom of things and help to understand the real situation which is occurring in Europe, well, then that can be communicated here and in other parts of the world as well. This has a social projection, though, the desires of the spirit and the more material desires. And essentially, if we go to the very base of Western society, we can find two tendencies which in some ways reflect the two different tendencies of man. We want to speak about spiritual and material desires. The one tendency I'm going to refer to here as Hebraism. Now you might refer to it as religiosity. You might refer to it as a tendency towards the moral, towards the good. And there's another tendency which has also developed, which is more humanistic, we can say. Now I want to start from the beginning by saying neither of these are evil. A religious tendency is not evil. A humanistic tendency is not evil. Essentially, though, there has to be a kind of balance between the two. But it seems that often both sides have gone to extremes. And the consequence of those extremes is that there's been a kind of conflict between, let's say, the religious and spiritual ideals of man and humanism. Hebraism, of course, is characterized by the whole of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but many times as a symbol or as representative of that tradition, we are called to think of Moses. Moses, an individual, and when we study the whole Exodus narration in the Bible, we recognize that it seems that time and time again that when individuals try to do things on their own, that the consequence of that is that they're castigated by God. The humanistic tradition, according to Karl Marx, and likewise according to Albert Camus in his text, The Rebel, is perhaps on its extreme characterized by Prometheus. Prometheus, the demigod, was responsible for bringing fire to men. And as a consequence of him going against the will of Zeus, he finds himself chained to a mountain, and day after day, an eagle comes to eat from his liver. Because he feels fundamentally that God is unjust and man is right. So we find these two dimensions. One extreme which maybe turns towards God, another which sometimes overemphasizes the importance of man. And we find that there was, at the end of feudalism, we can't go through the whole development of Hebraism and Hellenism, but if we had time, we certainly could. We would find that these two currents, particularly in the last 2,000 years, have a tremendous interplay, very rarely harmony between the two. Maybe we can talk about Augustine, or maybe we might mention Aquinas, but it seems like the cases are very rare where someone was able to come close to a harmonization of these two. But instead we find that very often there's a kind of competition. And Hebraism and Hellenism went through a process of revival toward the end of the feudal age. We can say the revival of Hebraism was embodied in the 16th century by the Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. We can mention figures such on the side of the Protestant Reformation, such as Luther. On the Catholic side, we can mention such people as Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. Essentially, the Reformation was characterized by a spiritual awakening. Certain values came to be emphasized again. It was internal values, or spiritual values, or ideas, recognizing the importance of a relationship with God. And likewise, speaking about the need for a personal relationship with Christ and the Bible. Almost simultaneously, we find a revival of Hellenism, or humanism, through the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is characterized by individuals such as Descartes, who really goes to the very essence and asks, what can I know? What do I know? And builds a whole system such as had never existed before of philosophical inquiry. Individuals such as Copernicus and Galileo, depicted here, who challenged the traditional concept of the universe, and ultimately their discoveries had tremendous scientific and philosophical implications. Individuals such as Machiavelli, who in many ways is seen as one of the founders of modern political thought, both from the side of totalitarianism, but likewise from the viewpoint that he challenged the concept of the monarchy being something that was descended from divine right. Suddenly the monarch became a man like other men. It was an opening point to a lot of political discussion, which eventually was one of the reasons which laid the foundation for a democratization of values and of perceptions of the human being. The Renaissance, we can say, was more external in nature, more emphasizing intellectual ideals rather than moral development of man, and focused more upon the development of science and humanistic. The Renaissance and the Reformation, 2 centuries later, both experienced a kind of reinforcement. The Reformation was strengthened and revived through what was referred to in the United States as the Great Awakening, and through what was referred to in Europe as the Pietist movement of the 17th and 18th century. The Great Awakening was characterized in the United States by individuals such as Jonathan Edwards and Whitefield, once again emphasizing the importance of a relationship with God. Pietism and the Great Awakening reacted to formalism and to intellectualism within the field of theology. It called for a return to Bible study. It recognized the need for personal religious experiences. The Renaissance also experienced a renewal, and that renewal occurred through the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment saw the emergence of the Renaissance men, an effort to be able to capture a very broad understanding of various disciplines which surround us. The Enlightenment constituted, in many ways, a challenge to a long tradition. It represented a questioning of doctrines and values. It emphasized the importance and the role of individualism. It spoke about a concept of universal human progress, that humanity was destined to go forward, that progress was something which had to occur. The Enlightenment emphasized the empirical method first developed by Bacon, the rationalism of Descartes. And there are several important effects of the Enlightenment. One of those effects is the strengthening of deism. So I'd like to speak just a little bit about deism, because in the presentation we want to make, deism has a very important role. Deism emerged because of a number of factors, but fundamentally, if we want to go back to the very roots of deism, we would have to relate to Copernicus. Copernicus challenged the Ptolemaic view of the universe. He challenged the view that the center of our system was the Earth, and instead said that the center of our system was the Sun. Copernicus was challenged by religious authorities. Luther refused the publication of his text in Germany, and posthumously, Copernicus likewise was excommunicated from the church. Today, as you know, Pope John the 23rd is in the process of reevaluating and started a commission to reevaluate the views on Galileo, because Galileo likewise advanced this challenge to the Ptolemaic view of the universe. And over a period of time, ultimately, particularly through Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton, it became clear that Copernicus' discoveries were true. The Earth began to be seen as one of many other planets. And likewise, the universe began to be seen as having certain laws and principles, and as being almost a machine, because these laws and principles were so precise, as was shown by the development particularly of certain laws and principles discovered by Newton in the area of physics. Now, deism had an impact upon two political events. One of those was the American Revolution. When we study the development of the American Revolution, nevertheless, it seems that the American Revolution comes more in the line of the religious tradition of the Reformation and the Great Awakening. When we consider the American Revolution, we know that from the very beginning, the first people that came to the United States came there because of religious principles and ideals, for the purpose of religious freedom. If we consider the inaugural address of George Washington, we find that in his first inaugural address, he fully dedicated 1/3 of his speech to imploring divine providence to guide the new nation of America. Jefferson was a deist. He felt that God had created the universe, and the universe was like a machine with certain precise laws and principles. But although Jefferson was a deist, he nevertheless very much defended religious freedom. In the American Revolution, traditional Christianity And deism, which was we can say a modernized view of God and of how God worked through nature, had a very beautiful harmony. And when the Bill of Rights was written, there was a very strong defense for the need in America for religious freedom. Article 1 of the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That religious tradition continued in the United States up and through Lincoln. At the time of the Civil War, America confronted with the sin of slavery, divided. At that moment, Lincoln called upon the American people to join with him together in a national day of repentance and fasting. When the great French historian Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States for the first time, he attributed America's growth and prosperity to religious principles. De Tocqueville said, I searched for the greatness of America in her harbors and factories and streams, but I did not find it there. It was only when I visited her churches and found her pulpits aflame with righteousness that I understood the greatness of America. America is great because America is good. And when America ceases to be good, she shall also cease to be great. So long as America followed certain religious principles and tried to practice those principles, America could be blessed. The culmination of the developments of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in terms of 18th century political thought can be related to the French Revolution. Here we see the siege of the Bastille. The French Revolution, in many ways, can be attributed to, and this is a point that's made by French new historian François Furet, can be attributed to a reaction to Louis XIV, to an excess of centralization which existed in France beginning in the 18th century. Famous phrase of Louis XIV, "L'État c'est moi." During his reign, Louis XIV suppressed religious freedom. He suppressed the Catholic mystics, and in 1685 he retracted the Edict of Nantes. The effect of the end of religious freedom in France at that time caused a tremendous reaction amongst the intellectuals who were to follow. Particularly, for example, Voltaire was very much upset by what resulted when religious freedom was ended in France. The French Revolution in 1789 can be viewed as a reaction to absolutism. Likewise, in terms of the French Revolution, many factions saw Christianity as a tool of the aristocracy. And they came to be suspect of religion as a whole. Instead of applauding religious freedom, if we study the French Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789, we find that there it is written, no one may be disturbed on account of his opinions, even religious ones, as long as the manifestation of such opinions does not interfere with the established law and order. So it seems almost that the least of opinions is religious ones, even religious ones. In the case of the French Revolution, likewise, we find that deism, a more scientific view of God, instead of aligning with and harmonizing with Christianity, in fact, the deists had a tendency to polarize towards agnosticism and atheism, and confronted Christianity. Many factions during the French Revolution spoke about the need for the de-Christianization of France. Deism, as we have seen, saw the world as a machine. And particularly in the case of French deism, the view was that the machine had a machine maker, God. God had made the machine. Equality was justified by the fact that each individual was a part of that machine. All of us were a part of the machine, and any parts taken away from the machine won't operate. So therefore men are equal. However, according to this view of deism, likewise, it was maintained that once God had created the machine, he went away from the machine. And the machine proceeded to develop from there. So how did the machine develop? That was something that man had to discover. And particularly, in the 18th century, it became very popular to consider how it was that life began. How it was that man became man. It was Darwin who developed the concept that man had evolved from a monkey. And Darwinism spoke about certain principles. One of the principles that Darwin discovered was the principle of natural selection. He maintained that in any given species, certain members of that species were born and more capable of surviving than other members of the species. And together with Herbert Spencer, he referred to that as the concept of the survival of the fittest. For example, if there were two deer, and one deer was able to run very quickly, and another deer was born with some kind of an impediment, making it difficult for that deer to run, that second deer might very well end up being the dinner of a lion. And so Darwin said, this is the principle of survival of the fittest. Now, it's one thing to apply those principles to nature. It's quite another thing when they are applied to society. But Herbert Spencer took the principles of Darwin and he said that they needed to be applied to society as well. And applying those principles to society, he came to all kinds of conclusions. He concluded that inside of a society, some members of the human species were inferior to other members of the human species. Some were not fit to live well, and others were very fit to live well. And also, Spencer said that these principles could be applied to races as well. Spencer said that some races were destined to dominate other races. They were genetically superior. They were destined to dominate other races. And the principles of Spencer, tragically, had a tremendous impact in the West. Spencer began to talk about people that were fit and others that were not fit. He began to say that it was a tragedy that those who were not fit were allowed to reproduce. And all of Spencer's ideas, which seemed to be very scientific, came to be a basis to justify the domination by some nations of other nations, to justify the domination of some people by other people. Social Darwinism, we can say therefore, served as an excuse for social injustice in the West. Served as a way to justify the situation of exploited workers. As we mentioned, one of the developments of the Enlightenment, the concept of universal human progress. This generation of workers had to be sacrificed because later on a dynamic technological society was going to come forward. Supposedly by 1850, that society didn't come. And more dissatisfaction emerged because of the situation of the workers. And someone had to speak out for the workers. And the logical ones to speak out for the workers would be the followers of Christ, the Christians. However, because of the concept of predestination, which came to have a tremendous importance in Western society, and because predestination became applied not only theologically, but also socio-politically, the principles of Calvin were abused. Prosperity came to be interpreted by many as a proof of salvation. Those who lived well because this was a testimony that they had been saved by God, saved by Christ. Some were seen as predestined for prosperity. Prosperity, a proof of their salvation. And others, the poor, the hungry, were not saved. They lived that way because they were not saved. They were not part of the elect. So the amazing thing is that predestination speaks about the survival of social Darwinism speaks about the survival of the fittest, and predestination speaks about an elect. And when that was applied socio-politically, a very tragic coincidence occurred. kind of a theological justification for exploitation occurring. Predestination in a socio-political context justified survival of the fittest. There were very few who spoke out about the conditions of the worker. We can mention people such as John Wesley. We can talk about it, and Albert Schweitzer, who was concerned about the state of the Third World. But when that voice was not loud enough, people began to look for another voice. And the voice that became the strongest was the voice of Marx and Engels. To many of them, Christianity became a caricature. Words one thing, deeds something completely different. In his recent book, Question de Principe, French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy speaks about the need for principles. And yet when principles are said and not lived, particularly young people have a tendency to revolt. And in the 1960s, that revolt became more and more intense against a system. And finally, even many, particularly in the Third World, were ready to take up arms. Because of this confusion, this tragic coincidence between survival of the fittest and the select, today we find that there's a tendency to reject the West. Particularly, we saw this in the 1960s and in the early 1970s as a system which was hypocritical. But the ideals, the original ideals, are something which are very great. And at this time, those ideals need to be revived. Because the 20th century, it seems to be a most crucial and important moment in history. A time when Christianity is being challenged. And particularly, Christianity and the democratic world is facing three challenges in this century. The first of those challenges was World War I. The second was World War II. And the third refers to World War III. World War I is a case where essentially authoritarian governments confronted more democratic nations of England, France, and the United States. Not such a clear confrontation. In the case of World War II, however, it becomes tremendously clear. Hitler challenges not only the democratic world, but challenges the very essence of the Christian ideal. As we know, during Nazi Germany, there's even cases of the Passion plays, famous German Passion plays, where instead of speaking about Jesus, they spoke about poor Adolf. Really trying to supplant Christianity with nothing more than a projection of his own self. What about World War III? Essentially, we can say that World War III, when will it start? Well, basically it started right after World War II, if not in 1917, because from the very beginning, or even 1848, communism has declared war upon the existing Western system. Marxism-Leninism has an ability, as we have seen, I have a little bit of a problem with this, the slides, has an ability to inspire young people with the promise of peace. Even it's able to reach children. In the case of the takeover of Managua, Nicaragua, the first people that marched into Managua were children because they felt that the Somocista guards wouldn't fire upon children. Those who died for the revolution are seen as heroes. We've spoken a lot about the atrocities of communism. But someone had to speak out and stand up against that kind of situation. And particularly, once again, just as the exploitation of the worker, it was the Christian that has to speak out about that. Today it is the responsibility of Christians to speak out about the tragic situation of the development of communism. But we find a confusing trend within communism, within Christianity today as well, which is known as liberation theology. Liberation theology, which has developed all throughout Latin America, North America, Africa, and which can be related to the Christian Marxism of Europe in a lot of ways as well, and has its roots in Europe. Liberation theology applauds the Christian revolutionary. This is, for example, the front page of a pamphlet that was passed out in Nicaragua. about Christian revolutionaries, that this is the ideal of the Christian. Liberation theologian, Uruguayan José Miguel Bonino, asked a simple question. Today, for exploited man, today for the exploited Christian, who is Jesus Christ? And Bonino's response is, Jesus Christ is Che Guevara. Likewise, liberation theology has taken the story of Moses, the Exodus narration, and interpreted that in light of the situation which exists today. Today, Moses must liberate the people. The liberators are those who challenge today's Pharaoh. And in Latin America, who is today's Pharaoh? Uncle Sam. Camilo Torres, famous Colombian priest who did his studies at the University of Leuven in Belgium, tried all kinds of ways to relate to to those who were suffering. And when he couldn't find a proper channel to help those who lived in miserable conditions, he came to one conclusion, that the only way that the Christian could act today was by committing himself to revolution. In the words of Camilo Torres, the only true revolutionary is he who has gone to the hills with a rifle to participate in the Marxist revolution. In the case of Nicaragua, it's manifestly clear, this is the Cathedral at Managua, it's manifestly clear that it would be impossible for the Sandinista takeover to have occurred without the support of liberation theology. But what is the situation of Christianity in Nicaragua since the takeover there? Well, Christianity, in accord with the liberation theological view, is based upon historical materialism. But as William Lay explained yesterday, the roots of historical materialism are founded in dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is based upon the view that God does not exist. If God does not exist, then how is the Nicaraguan government going to treat Christians? If you consider the official newspaper of Nicaraguan government, Causa, what do they say today about Christians? Well, those Christians whom they don't like, they're beginning to eliminate them. This is a newspaper article that says, popular protest against the sects, religious sects. Now, those sects don't only include minorities, but also they include a part of the Catholic Church which does not subscribe to the popular church, which already Pope John Paul II has spoken against, which is just an instrument which is used to support Managua in many ways. A popular protest. Who is behind the popular protest? In Nicaragua, they refer to those people as turbos. They're people that are used at any time to militate when the Nicaraguan government wants to do something. There are no protests in Nicaragua against the lack of toothpaste, because those things aren't allowed. So a popular protest means a government-maneuvered protest. In other words, Christianity, which supported the Nicaraguan revolution, is today being completely abused by the government which benefited from that support. Here's a headline from Baricala again. The invasion of the sects, talking about the fanaticism of Christians. Castro said very clearly, I am using Christianity with a very clear strategic purpose. The fruit of communism we've already talked about. Hunger and death. Yesterday we saw in the film about 150 million dead in Soviet Russia. In the communist world, 150 million dead. This is an article in Boston calling people to a demonstration, mentioning that every second 3 animals die in American laboratories. This demonstration was held April 24th, 1983 in Boston. My understanding is that this demonstration was able to gather 5,000 people for a demonstration for the killing of animals. Now, I'm not denying the importance of that. I'm not trying to mock it. All I'm saying is that there's a tremendous confusion in priorities. When people are being victimized by communism, 150 million dead. When have 5,000 people gathered in New York or Boston or Paris because of the victims of communism? They gather because of animals, but somehow we don't deal with the reality. We choose to live in a kind of dream, and the killing continues. Life becomes something absurd. Even though the Soviets have their goals, we want to talk about peace. We don't want to have cruise missiles in Europe. And meanwhile, the Soviet war machine grows and grows and grows. And by 2000, as Colonel Falcon mentioned yesterday, the communists are fixed upon controlling the world. And we continue to negotiate, thinking that they're ready to compromise, when their goal has been clearly declared since the beginning: world domination, and nothing less than that. So how can we respond to this situation? Let's draw the conclusion. We have seen that the religious tradition of Hebrewism was revived various times, but we're speaking only about more recent history, was revived in the 16th century through the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. We saw that 2 centuries later, it was again revived through the Great Awakening and the Pietist movement. We saw that these principles served as fundamental bases for the establishment of many of the ideals of Western democracy. But what's the culminating point today of Western democracy? Western democracy today has culminated in materialism and selfishness. We've likewise seen, in terms of the development of humanism, that Hellenism was revived in the 15th, 16th century through the Renaissance, again in the 18th century through the Enlightenment, and that this served as the political basis of the French Revolution. And likewise, as we know, Marx saw the French Revolution as a very significant step in the revolution of class. So the Enlightenment also was one of the main sources of ideas for the development and the emergence of communism. But where does communism stand today? Has communism solved man's problems? We have seen the economically disastrous situation of communism, but that's not all. In the French journal A l'Est, a recent publication mentions the fact that in terms of crime in the Soviet Union, every 5 minutes there's a murder. Every 30 seconds there's a rape. Every 1 second there's a break-in. So how is it different from the West? Essentially, it's not. The average Soviet worker spends 28% of his food budget on alcohol. Now, for example, in nations such as Hungary, there's a tremendous problem of drugs amongst the youth. As we have mentioned, there's the very real problem of poverty. So, something that was at first very, very exciting, the Communist Revolution, once the Communist Revolution becomes a reality, instead of being very exciting, it's becoming quite boring. It's no different than anything that existed in the past. There's a very interesting joke about that as well. As you know, Bill Day was explaining yesterday that communism society has passed through different stages. It's gone through, for example, feudalism and capitalism and socialism, and finally it's supposed to emerge into true communism. Well, the Soviets are kind of in a dilemma because of their situation. As we know, they weren't even a capitalist society when they created, when the Soviet society came to be a reality. But anyway, they say that today they've kind of gone through capitalism, and they're going through socialism, and they haven't reached true communism, and they're in a very interesting stage right now, which they've discovered between socialism and true communism. So they're wondering, well, what can we call it? We can't call it feudalism, we can't call it capitalism, we can't call it socialism. So someone suggested, why don't you call it alcoholism? Anyways, communism has culminated in materialism and selfishness, exactly the same. A new class, new master, exploitation, imperialism. In other words, these two tendencies today are at a dead end. And mankind is in need of a new vision, a new way of going forward. And Causa feels that the way that this can be done is through a new perspective or a new worldview, and which will be centered upon God, a God-centered worldview, which we might refer to as Godism. Now, we have mentioned that in order for that to happen, there must be a harmonization. Humanism is not bad. Faith in God is not bad, but there must be a harmonization of these two tendencies. A proper form of relationship between the two. In accordance with the Causa worldview, it's essential to have absolute values, to go back to absolute values, because if there's no absolute values or ideals, then we can never really build an ideal society. So we feel that man must search for spiritual ideals. This must be a priority, not something which is just kind of put aside. And there must be a harmonization between religious tradition and humanism. In the 20th century, science is advancing so quickly. I received an article yesterday from General David Waldman, who's participating in this seminar, and the paper that he gave me mentioned that scientific knowledge grows 2 times every generation since the time of Abraham Lincoln, and that half of the things which a person is studying in the university today in the field of science, biology, physics, chemistry, or whatever, was not known when that child was born. These were undiscovered. Scientific discovery is occurring at such an incredible rate. But modern scientific discovery, as we mentioned, the theory of entropy, Einstein's theory of relativity, these concepts challenge a purely materialist view of history, challenge a purely materialist interpretation of reality, and call for us to consider a different interpretation, a different view of reality, which would relate to spiritual ideals. Causa believes that God exists. And perhaps the most dramatic example or proof or testimony which would indicate that there is a God is if we consider the culminating point of creation, which is the human being. There is no other being which has the capacity which a human being has. Now, even from Darwin's perspective of evolution, the human being is the final stage. But if we consider the whole chain, there is no other being, whether it's a monkey or whatever, which has the capacity to relate to almost all aspects of the creation. You don't see monkeys that appreciate the beauty of flowers, or dogs that appreciate the beauty of a setting sun, or whatever. Most animals are colorblind. But human beings are very particular because they have the ability to appreciate the sea, plants, animals, fish, stars, heaven, etc. Now we have to ask ourselves, is it really by pure chance that at the end of a whole evolutionary process, suddenly there emerges one being who has the ability to relate to everything in creation or in nature? Why isn't the being before that able to relate to almost everything? It is the perspective and the view of Causa that God created humanity with a very particular and special role as an intermediary between himself and the creation. And so from the Causa worldview, what is a human being? Every woman is a daughter of God. Every man is a son of God. And this is very, very important, because if we truly believe that people are daughters of God or sons of God, we can't send them to gas chambers. We can't send them to gulags. If we really understand the true value of human beings, then our relationship with human beings must change. Mother Teresa speaks of this. She says that when for the first time she went out into the streets of India and found a person who was very soon to die and picked up the person, she was at first totally repulsed by that. But then she said she looked in the eyes of that person and she said that she saw Christ. Every individual is a son of God, is a daughter of God. Every individual has potential which is beyond imagination. And the root of all problems is selfishness. If we can be able to go beyond selfishness, we can end everything. we said yesterday, what is racism? It's a selfish race exploiting another race. What is war? It's a selfish nation attacking another nation, aggressing against another nation. What is communism? It's a selfish class of people saying, well, we want to get everything. It's playing with people's selfishness. But man has so much potential because every person has the capacity to live at incredible levels. A person can live for himself or herself, yes, but those kinds of people are not the people that history remembers. A person can live for his or her family, and that person will be remembered by that family. Or a person can be able to live for his or her nation. Or indeed, in history we have those rare individuals who have been able to live for the world. In the Causa worldview, all human beings are one family, beyond race and beyond creed. It was the President John F. Kennedy who said in his inaugural address, "We must help the poor and the hungry throughout the world. We must make efforts to do so, not because of the danger of communism, but because it is right. And the reason it is right is because we are all one family under God. And when we can feel that we are all one family under God, and that all human beings are brothers and sisters, then naturally our ethical relations are destined to change." Thank you.
Okay, let's just take about 15 minutes break. I think we have some more coffee set up outside. And then we'll begin at 11:25, okay? All right. See you back.
¿Cómo quiero? Y contemporáneamente en nuestro lecho hay unos difíciles
Good morning. Good morning, you. Good morning. When Reverend Moon came to America, he gave his message in his native tongue, Korean, and I have a great privilege of translating his message from Korean to English.
Quand le révérend Moon est venu aux États-Unis, il a donné son message dans sa langue maternelle coréenne. Et j'ai eu le grand privilège de traduire pour lui.
So in America, I have collected the nickname, the mouth of Reverend Moon.
En Amérique, quand j'ai le sobriquet, la bouche de révérend Moon.
Then I went to South America, Central and South America, since I could not speak Spanish too well. So I have to use my mouth. In that case, our Secretary General, Antonio Betancourt, to play that role.
Quand je suis venu en Amérique latine, je ne pouvais pas parler l'espagnol, donc j'avais besoin d'une bouche. Et cette bouche était notre secrétaire général, M. Antonio Betancourt.
Then I come to Paris. I have to find no mouth.
Quand j'arrive à Paris, je dois chercher une autre bouche. Avec un accent.
We found one, Tom Ward.
J'en ai trouvé une.
However, it is rather no experiment for both of us because English is not my native tongue. Korean is my native tongue. I learned English. And French is not Tom's native tongue. He's American. Good American. So far in trying to put together some product, you're going to have a fine show today.
C'est un petit problème, parce que pour le colonel, il dit ma langue maternelle n'est pas l'anglais, c'est le coréen. Et pour moi, ma langue maternelle n'est pas le français, c'est l'anglais. Donc ça va être une expérience très intéressante. Vous allez avoir un très joli show aujourd'hui.
The reason I like to have this simultaneous translation because the kind of message, shall we say, content we are trying to convey next few hours is very intensive period. And therefore, not just the voice. I would like to convey this message through expression, person to person, spirit to spirit. For the reason I employ this method, having the simultaneous translation.
La raison que je veux employer la traduction consécutive est parce que le message qu'on va partager avec vous aujourd'hui est un message très important. Et pour cela, il ne s'agit pas seulement de communiquer des paroles, mais aussi, disons, l'esprit. C'est un message qui est très personnel. Et pour cette raison, je préfère employer cette méthode de la traduction consécutive.
Yesterday and today, I'd like to have a word of gratitude to those French participants because you've been very patient and generous to accommodate yourself on that poor quality translation equipment.
Pour aujourd'hui et aussi pour hier, je veux exprimer mon remerciement aux participants français parce que pendant ces 2 journées, vous avez dû durer les difficultés de cette équipe de traduction qui n'était pas toujours très bonne.
So this method is again the liberation to the French participants so that we can serve you a little better.
Donc cette méthode est une sorte de libération pour les participants français. Au moins on peut vous servir un peu mieux. Vous allez voir.
Before going into the point, I'd like to also make understanding very clear on 3 points.
Avant de faire mes points principaux, je veux clarifier 3 choses.
First of all, our presentation here today and tomorrow will be based on philosophical viewpoint, not definitely trying to bring any theology of any particular religion or denomination. I want to make this very clear.
D'abord, ce qu'on va présenter ici aujourd'hui et demain, je veux clarifier que c'est basé sur des concepts philosophiques. On veut vous présenter une perspective philosophique et cela n'a rien à voir avec la théologie. Ce n'est pas notre but ici de vous présenter, disons, une perspective d'une religion particulière.
This is not the intention of bringing any particular religious thought. They are philosophy here presenting designed to counter communism, Marxism, Leninism, and bring positive solution to that ideology. This is the basic purpose.
Ce n'est pas notre but de présenter la perspective d'une dénomination. Ce que l'on veut faire ici aujourd'hui, c'est de vous présenter, on peut dire, les bases philosophiques pour affronter le communisme.
The founder of this movement is Reverend Sun Myung Moon.
Le fondateur de ce mouvement est le révérend Sun Myung Moon.
But he today is truly the greatest anti-communist fighter in our world.
Mais aujourd'hui, il est certainement le plus grand des lutteurs anticommunistes dans le monde.
He also founded religion called Unification Church.
Il a aussi établi une religion aux États-Unis et dans le monde qui s'appelle l'Église de l'unification.
For the next few hours, today and tomorrow, you will not hear anything about the unification theology, such as our method of salvation, our particular interpretation of Savior, or the manner of observing a religious doctrine. That will be totally void.
Mais pendant ces journées-là, vous n'allez pas écouter la théologie de l'Église de l'unification. Vous n'allez pas écouter, par exemple, notre interprétation du salut, ou qu'est-ce qui est pour nous un sauveur. Vous n'allez pas écouter notre doctrine.
Also, the principle we present might sound very new to you. I'm sure. Otherwise, it is very good in a way. Otherwise, we have no purpose to be here. We have nothing new to present, then we have no purpose coming to Paris.
Aussi, les idées, les conseils qu'on va présenter, peut-être vont vous paraître des choses nouvelles, on peut dire, des idées nouvelles, en fait. Mais ça, c'est très normal, parce que si on n'avait pas quelque chose de nouveau, ça n'aurait pas de sens pour nous de venir ici.
So I want you to understand, if any content I present so contradict your religious principle, or your doctrine, or your own understanding of God or whatever, then we say, keep yours, don't take mine or ours, because your religious doctrine comes first. We are here just to inspire, to stimulate your thought, not to swap any ideas, or not to impose any ideas. I want to make this point very clear.
Donc, s'il y a quelque chose qu'on dit pendant ces jours qui contredit vos propres interprétations religieuses, ou qui représente un défi à vos perspectives religieuses, je veux dire maintenant déjà que vous devez garder vos propres points de vue. Et ce n'est pas notre but ici d'imposer sur vous nos interprétations théologiques. Ce n'est pas notre but ici de forcer des choses quand vous avez déjà vos idées. Vous devez garder vos idées.
So there's absolutely no pressure. And you'll be relaxed and listen and be inspired. There is all.
Donc, il n'y aura absolument aucune pression. Vous devez vous sentir chez vous. Vous devez vous sentir très, très à l'aise ici.
Furthermore, it is Causa's belief. In the end, even though certain things we may not agree, may disagree each other, but we do know in the end, we'll come up with a sufficient common ground to unite, common purpose to unite. This is the goal of Causa.
Et aussi, il est le point de vue de Causa que même s'il y a des différences d'opinion entre nous, que finalement, on va chercher des terrains communs pour qu'on puisse travailler, pour qu'on puisse collaborer ensemble. Ça, c'est ce que Causa veut faire.
Like this. So far, we have been listening to Marxism, Leninism, the basic doctrine, and therefore the sort of the critique on those ideologies.
Jusque maintenant, on a écouté surtout les théories marxistes-léninistes et les critiques de ces théories-là.
So we could say, so far, part one, phase one, is sort of like a process understanding our adversary or enemy who are trying to take our value away.
Donc on peut dire que cette première partie est un effort de comprendre nos adversaires ou nos ennemis qui veulent nous priver de la liberté.
If we win, however, we need two parts. Know our enemy and know ourselves. Without these two parts, we cannot successfully win.
Si nous voulons gagner la victoire, il est très important non seulement connaître nos ennemis, mais aussi nous devons savoir qui est-ce que nous sommes. Nous devons connaître soi-même.
So from this point on, we're inviting you to join with us the journey to know ourselves and our potential.
Donc à partir de maintenant, on veut vous inviter de venir avec nous pendant qu'on essaie de connaître soi-même. Qui est-ce qu'on est?
Once again, welcome to Causa. an introduction to the Causa worldview.
Encore une fois, bienvenue à Causa. Et maintenant, on va écouter l'introduction à la perspective Causa.
You heard so much already about communism. Let us ask one crucial question. What is the core evil of communism? What is the bottom line?
Vous avez déjà écouté beaucoup à propos du communisme. Mais maintenant, on va poser une question. Quel est vraiment le noyau du mal du communisme?
Well, many say communism is evil because they deprive of our freedom.
Beaucoup de personnes disent, bon, le communisme est mauvais parce que cela détruit de la liberté.
They're evil because they deprive of our private property.
Ils sont mauvais parce qu'ils nous privent de la propriété privée.
Well, they're evil because they deprive of human rights, human dignity.
Mais ils sont mauvais parce qu'ils nous privent des droits de l'homme.
Well, they're evil because their goal is global conquest, totalitarian global conquest.
Enfin, ils sont mauvais parce que leur but c'est la conquête mondiale, totalitaire.
Each one of those has its own merit to stand on its own and are good enough to oppose communism with all our might.
Chacune de ces raisons sont suffisantes pour nous mettre contre le communisme, pour nous opposer au communisme.
The problem is, there's a confusion. Because those things communism themselves claim and trying to appeal to people, instead of taking it away, they say, we'll give you freedom. We'll give you private property. We are the advocates of human rights. We justify global conquest because that is this imperialistic, democratic free society, what they call, it are the ones preventing utopia.
Mais il y a un problème, parce que les communistes eux-mêmes, ils promettent ces choses. Ils disent, mais on veut lutter pour vos libertés. C'est pour ça la révolution, on va vous donner la liberté que vous cherchez. Ou bien on peut dire, on lutte pour vos droits humains. C'est le but du communisme pour que vous puissiez vraiment avoir vos droits. On est là pour lutter pour ces principes. Donc si on parle de ces éléments, ce sont exactement les éléments qui sont les soi-disant raisons d'être du communisme.
When you go to El Salvador, Guatemala, for example, those guerrillas and terrorists come to the village and are saying to the peasant, all right, you help us our revolution, then we'll give you all the land you can see, all the good houses you can possess. They promise the property instead of taking property away.
Vous allez par exemple au Salvador, au Guatemala, vous allez vous rendre compte là-bas que les communistes, ils disent par exemple aux paysans, aux gens de la campagne, vous voyez tous ces terrains maintenant qui appartiennent aux richards, après la révolution, sont à vous. On va vous donner tous ces terrains après la révolution.
They have a promise of communism. They pledge their promises. And first, that is workers' paradise, utopia.
Il y a une série de promesses du communisme. Ils jurent certaines victoires après le communisme. D'abord, on parle de l'utopie des travailleurs.
Second, they promise classless society.
On parle d'une société sans classe.
They promise total freedom and democracy.
On parle de la liberté totale et la démocratie.
Today, communism uses more word democracy than anybody else. People Republic, Democratic Republic, so and so. They use more words democracy and peace and freedom than any other society.
Plus que personne, les communistes parlent de la démocratie. Ils parlent toujours de la République populaire de Chine, de la République populaire de tel ou tel pays.
And they promise abundance of goods.
Et ils promettent aussi une abondance des biens, une abondance des marchandises.
And to make a long story short, we heard today that their promise has not been delivered. And that promise turned into a nightmare of men.
Enfin, pendant ces 2 journées, jusqu'à maintenant, on a vu que leurs promesses n'ont pas pu se réaliser. Et au lieu de réaliser ces promesses, le rêve communiste est arrivé à être un cauchemar.
Last 66 years, the communistic experiment proved, instead of being a workers' utopia, they provided workers living hell.
Au lieu de donner aux travailleurs une utopie, ils ont donné aux travailleurs un enfer vivant.
Instead of classes society, nomenclatura, new class emerges, cruel masters, they have to live under.
Au lieu d'une société sans classe, nous voyons qu'il y a des nouvelles classes, la nomenclature qui est là, des maîtres cruels.
Total freedom? Where can we see? Instead we see total enslavement.
On ne trouve pas la liberté totale, ce qu'on trouve c'est l'esclavage total.
And economic disaster everywhere.
Et on voit un désastre économique.
Cuba, for example, the 1 out of 10 they exiled, in other words, moved out of their own country to the United States, about 1 million people.
Si on prend par exemple l'exemple du Cuba, nous savons que pour la population de Cuba, de chaque 10 personnes, une personne est partie du Cuba.
Bare hand, without nothing. They just fled from their homeland.
Ils sont partis sans rien avoir.
What happened today? The 1 million Cubans in the United States are enjoying 10 times more economy of the entire 10 million Cubans in the island.
Qu'est-ce qui est la réalité aujourd'hui? 1 million de Cubains qui vivent aux États-Unis ont 10 fois plus de prospérité que les 10 millions de Cubains qui sont au Cuba.
Denial of God, existence of God. This is the bottom line. This is where core evil of communism is coming from.
Le noyau du mal dans le communisme se trouve dans le fait qu'il nie l'existence de Dieu.
When a Marxism denies God and trying to build the philosophy upon the absolute materialism, this is the root cause of evil. This becomes a state policy. This becomes a root cause of evil.
Quand les marxistes ont nié l'existence de Dieu et ils ont essayé de construire une société basée sur le matérialisme, eh bien l'effet de ça c'est la souffrance, les difficultés. C'est vraiment le noyau de tous les problèmes du communisme.
And when they deny God, then they certainly deny of the eternal life of man.
Quand ils nient l'existence de Dieu, ils nient aussi la vie éternelle de l'homme.
When there's no God, that means there's no absolute value.
Quand il n'y a pas un Dieu, il n'y a pas non plus des valeurs absolues.
Man is responsible to no one. There's no boss. In other words, there's no place they go where boss stops.
Quand il n'y a pas de Dieu, l'homme est responsable à personne. On peut dire qu'il n'y a pas de chef.
So man actually takes law into his own hands. Man becomes the law.
À ce moment-là, l'homme peut prendre le droit dans ses propres mains.
Man becomes God.
L'homme arrive à être Dieu.
This is precisely what the Marxists are all about. They are trying to take the God out of the planet. They take that place of God.
C'est exactement cela. Quand on parle du marxisme, il s'agit de cela. Ce qu'ils veulent faire les marxistes, finalement, est-ce qu'ils veulent mettre Dieu à la porte du planète? Ils veulent prendre la place de Dieu.
Furthermore, when state denies the eternal spirit of man, what happens? Man is becoming totally responsible.
Quand l'État nie l'esprit éternel de l'homme, qu'est-ce qui se passe? L'homme arrive à être totalement irresponsable.
Man set his own value.
L'homme peut fixer ses propres valeurs.
And man does anything without suffering any consequences.
L'homme peut faire ce qu'il veut sans aucune conséquence.
So they knew, as long as there's no God, there's no eternal life, They can do anything today and get away from it. There's no such a thing that certain action on earth have a eternal impact. They don't consider that at all.
Quand il n'y a pas de Dieu, quand il n'y a pas d'esprit éternel, l'homme peut faire ce qu'il veut. Parce que, finalement, les actions de l'homme sur cette terre n'ont pas d'implication éternelle.
When they set the law, well, revolution is the value. Well, that value system introduced, and anything that goes against revolution is less than that animal. Like a dirt. Like a bulldozer come to the airport and move the dirt. For what? They're moving the 150 million lives. Nothing to it. Nothing to it. No conscience bothered.
Quand tu le fixes comme une valeur, bon, la valeur la plus grande, c'est la révolution. Bon, à partir de ce moment-là, tout ce qui sert ce but a de la valeur. Donc, s'ils doivent tuer 100 millions de personnes, et après on va, avec un bulldozer, on va mettre ces corps autre part, ces actions n'ont pas de ramification parce que Dieu n'existe pas, et la valeur, ce qui a du sens, c'est la révolution.
This is why all common countries, the state of chastity and barbarism rule.
Il est pour cette raison que, peu importe quel pays communiste, ce que l'on trouve dans ces pays, c'est qu'il y a des atrocités de l'État et aussi la barbarie, qui sont vraiment les principes, qui sont les bases pour ces sociétés de continuer.
When there's no God, no eternal life of man, then the state becomes a beast.
Quand il n'y a pas de Dieu, quand il n'y a pas de vie éternelle, à ce moment-là, l'État arrive à être une bête.
I go a step further. The worse than the beast.
Je vais aller un pas plus loin, pire qu'une bête.
Beast is barbaric, but that's all. But human beings become more evil because they employ their wisdom in exterminating their own enemy. For example, the tiger, lion, and the snake, they have no wisdom to create the gas chamber, concentration camp. But man does, because he has wisdom employed for his evil.
Je dis pire qu'une bête. Pourquoi? Parce que les bêtes sont des prédateurs, oui, ça c'est vrai. Mais les bêtes ne peuvent pas employer leur sagesse pour faire du mal aux autres bêtes. Mais dans le cas des hommes, on voit que les hommes, pas comme les tigres ou comme d'autres bêtes, ils ont la capacité de créer des camps de concentration, de faire des tas de choses contre les autres hommes.
This is the reason any effort trying to compromise, reason together, with the communists would not work. Simply because you cannot reason together with the beast.
Il est pour cette raison qu'il est impossible d'essayer de raisonner avec les communistes. Parce que l'on ne peut pas raisonner avec une bête.
They kill, they lie, they extort.
Ils tuent, ils disent des mensonges, ils extorquent.
The end justifies the means. It's an important slogan Lenin spoke. And they practice it.
Les fins justifient les moyens. C'est une expression connue de Lénine. Et il pratique ce principe.
Human cost of communism, once again, 150 million lives known. How much more unknown? We have no way to know.
La coûte humaine du communisme, encore une fois, 150 millions de vies. Ça, c'est la statistique connue. Combien de plus? On ne sait pas.
Increasing every day.
Et chaque jour, cela augmente.
The communism is then what? First, it's the worst enemy of God.
Donc, qu'est-ce que c'est le communisme? D'abord, c'est le pire ennemi de Dieu.
Worst crimes against humanity.
Et aussi, le pire crime contre l'humanité.
The war against communism can be said is humanity against inhumanity.
On peut dire que la bataille contre le communisme représente une bataille entre l'humanité et l'inhumanité.
It's the worst inhumanity human history has ever known.
C'est le cas le plus flagrant de l'inhumanité que l'histoire a connu.
So I said at the opening effort, the anti-communism is not enough.
Il est pour cela que j'ai dit à l'ouverture de cette séminaire que l'anticommunisme n'est pas suffisant.
The anti, as I said, will not bring the positive result or the victory. It is a defensive.
L'anti ne peut pas apporter un résultat positif. Et le communisme, l'anti non plus ne peut pas apporter la victoire. Parce qu'il n'est pas positif, on peut dire.
So what we need is a positive solution.
Ce qu'il nous faut, c'est une solution positive, on peut dire.
This is coming from the ground floor. That ground floor level is ideological offensive. Ideological level.
Cela peut se réaliser uniquement à travers une nouvelle perspective, à travers une offensive, à travers une nouvelle perspective.
So then the bottom line of their evil is, as I said, is godlessness, God denying. Therefore, this ideological offensive must be centered upon God-centered worldview. This is the most logical.
Donc, comme j'ai déjà noté, la base fondamentale du communisme, c'est qu'il nie l'existence de Dieu. C'est la base fondamentale. Donc, dans cette nouvelle perspective, ce qui est essentiel à la base de toutes les choses est l'affirmation de l'existence de Dieu.
Therefore, Causa's worldview is centered upon God-centered. We call it Godism.
C'est pour cela que la perspective de Causa est centrée sur Dieu. Nous l'appelons le dieuisme.
The Causa is inviting all men and women to come to very basic God. Period.
Causa invite à tous les hommes et à toutes les femmes, de venir à l'élément le plus fondamental, les croyances en Dieu.
This will bring the solution to communism.
À travers une foi réelle, il sera possible de réaliser une solution au problème du communisme.
The communism can be compared to the darkness, like a room, like here, darkness.
On peut comparer le communisme à l'obscurité.
And how can you overcome the darkness?
Comment est-il possible d'arrêter cette situation d'obscurité?
Very simple solution. To turn on the light.
Très simple, il faut mettre la lumière.
Light the truth.
La lumière, c'est la vérité.
They've been operating on the deception and lie. So, how can you win communism? By bringing truth, light.
Les communistes ont opéré à travers des mensonges. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on peut trouver une solution? À travers une vérité.
The Paris is the city of light. Very meaningful name.
Paris, on l'appelle la ville des Lumières.
The Bible said the truth is light.
La Bible dit que la vérité est la lumière.
This is therefore, is no wonder why so an intellectual movement coming to Paris. And I know from this point on, the Paris is going to play the important intellectual role in positively combating communism and that ideology.
Pour cela, on ne doit pas être surpris qu'il y a beaucoup de mouvements intellectuels qui viennent à Paris. Et je sais qu'à partir de maintenant, Paris va jouer un rôle très important dans la lutte mondiale contre le communisme.
But fighting communism is not our end goal. It's not our final goal.
Mais notre but final, c'est pas lutter contre le communisme.
That's immediate and intermediate goal.
On peut dire que ça, c'est notre but immédiat.
The ultimate goal for Causa, or any human being here on earth, is to realize some dream. You know, like a Don Quixote. Everybody has dream. They thought it was impossible, but still pursuing that dream. The human being is living with dream, that's for sure, throughout entire history.
Le but final de l'homme, c'est de réaliser un idéal. Et on peut dire que ça c'est le but de toute l'histoire, finalement, la réalisation de certains idéaux. On peut prendre par exemple le cas de Don Quichotte. Ça représente la tendance de l'humanité à travers l'histoire, de chercher un rêve impossible.
This is the reason communistic appeal for the last 66 years has been so powerful, because they appeal to the human instinct, very basic. They might say, well, this might be the way to realize the age-old dream. That's the way people thought.
Ça nous explique le pouvoir du communisme. Pendant les derniers 60 ans, ils ont pu vraiment toucher les cœurs des gens parce que justement, ils touchent ce point-là. Ils touchent les hommes et les hommes sont, mais peut-être à travers cette idéologie, à travers ce message, je peux réaliser l'idéal.
They're trying to build that dream, a dreaming society, an ideal society without God for 66 years.
Depuis 60 ans, ils essaient de réaliser ce rêve sans Dieu.
And they failed.
Et ils ont échoué.
Now time has come. We asked them to get off the stage.
On est arrivé au point où il faut leur dire qu'ils doivent quitter la scène.
Karl Marx had 100 years since his death.
On a donné Karl Marx 100 ans depuis sa mort.
And biblically, 66 years is very meaningful.
Selon la Bible, le chiffre 66 a un sens très profond.
Time has come. The communism must get off the stage.
Le moment est arrivé, le communisme doit sortir de la scène.
Another human conscience must come on the stage, but this time with God.
Une autre conscience humaine doit venir, mais cette fois avec Dieu.
The Causa is trying to point what that dream would be and how we can achieve it.
Causa veut indiquer, veut suggérer qu'est-ce que cela représente ces rêves et comment on peut l'atteindre.
That therefore, we say our ultimate goal to create the foundation for lasting peace.
Pour cela, nous disons que notre but final est de réaliser le fondement pour la paix éternelle.
So on the deep understanding,
paix permanente.
the next 30 minutes, I'd like to present to you general overview of Godism. Introduction to it, very brief.
Pour cela, pendant ces 30 minutes, je voudrais vous présenter la perspective générale du diabolisme.
Then, of course, our story must begin from God.
Et pour cela, il faut commencer avec Dieu.
God is nothing new.
Dieu, ce n'est pas quelque chose de nouveau.
This is the oldest question and the newest question, the subject of God.
C'est la question la plus récente et c'est aussi la question la plus ancienne.
After lunch, when you come back, we're going to discuss about very plainly, talk about real basic question. Is there God? Let us handle that question after you come back after lunch.
Après le déjeuner, on va parler à propos de cette question. Dieu existe-t-il? Mais on va le faire après, avec le déjeuner, après le déjeuner.
But at this hour, for the argument's sake, let us assume God is.
Mais pour le moment, pour l'argument qu'on va présenter, disons que Dieu existe.
What kind of God would that be? You know, what is going to be the characteristic of God you can accept?
De quelle sorte de Dieu s'agit-il? Quels seraient, disons, les caractères de Dieu que l'homme pourrait accepter?
There have been Judeo-Christian understanding of God. There's nothing new to you.
On peut parler du concept de Dieu selon la tradition judéo-chrétienne. C'est pas quelque chose de nouveau pour vous.
Even other religion, you know, because the movement is spreading in Buddhist country like Japan, Korea, and Confucius country, and China, and so forth. But the Muslim country, it doesn't matter. All the religious country have at least common consensus. If there is God, what kind of God should be?
Mais en d'autres nations aussi, on peut voir, même Causa est en train de développer dans des pays bouddhistes, par exemple le Japon, là on a eu un succès très grand. Donc il faut chercher, disons, des principes généraux à propos de Dieu que tout le monde peut reconnaître, accepter.
Since we are addressing to the Christian culture, so basically I will not quote from the Bible, from the Buddhist Bible or Muslim, anything else. I like to, define, try to explain under the concept of Christian culture.
Parce que nous avons ici largement une audience chrétienne, je ne vais pas citer la tradition islamique ou la tradition bouddhiste, je vais surtout parler de la perspective de la tradition chrétienne à cause de cette audience.
Well, God must be good God.
Bon, d'abord, Dieu doit être bon.
You cannot conceive God as evil.
On ne peut pas s'imaginer que Dieu soit mauvais.
God must be almighty,
Dieu doit être tout-puissant
all powerful.
dans cette tradition.
Otherwise he could not create. He could not have a power to create.
Autrement, il ne pouvait pas créer.
God must be omnipresent,
Dieu doit être omniprésent,
everywhere, at the same time.
de tous les côtés en même temps.
God must be eternal,
Dieu doit être éternel,
unchanging.
incapable de changer.
If God is changing every day, His law is changing, we might as well pack up the luggage to go home. There's no use searching after that changing God.
Si Dieu est en train de changer ses idéaux, ses idées de tous les jours, on doit s'oublier de cette sorte de Dieu. C'est pas la peine d'essayer de le comprendre.
But the amazing thing we come to realize, we seldom talk about it and think about it, but when you really sit down and think, we're talking about God, the same God who ordered Abraham to offer his son Isaac, same God who gave 10 commandments to Moses, the same God who gave his son to the world in the name of Jesus. Today, in the 20th century, when man landed on the moon, and there's so many atrocities and the tragedy going on, we hear talking about the same God. Moses God, Abraham God, Jesus God, that is Paul God today. There's an amazing thing really, when you think.
C'est très intéressant si vous prenez le temps d'y réfléchir un peu, que quand on parle ici de Dieu aujourd'hui, on parle du même Dieu. Le Dieu qui a demandé à Abraham d'offrir son fils, Isaac. Le Dieu qui a donné à Moïse les 10 commandements. On parle exactement de ce même Dieu aujourd'hui duquel on a parlé à travers toute l'histoire humaine. C'est quelque chose d'incroyable si on pense que ce Dieu historique est le même Dieu qui nous intéresse maintenant.
The same God living, for eternity. That is your God and our God and my God, Tom God.
C'est le même Dieu qu'on a connu à travers l'éternité. Il est toujours vivant. Il est votre Dieu. Il est mon Dieu. Il est mon Dieu aussi. Il est le Dieu de tout le monde.
And we're talking about one God, unique God.
Et on parle d'un seul Dieu, un Dieu unique.
If God is coming like a General Motors automobile assembly plant, mass production, mass-produce God everywhere, we're in really trouble to really so much confusion. But we're dealing with one God, unique God.
Il n'y a qu'un Dieu. Si Dieu était quelqu'un qu'on pouvait produire pour des chaînes de production, si Dieu est quelqu'un qu'on peut produire en masse, enfin, on doit subir cette sorte de Dieu aussi.
And Causa view, this God created the world and man, or universe and man. For what purpose? This God cannot create anything other than good.
Dans la perspective Causa, Dieu a créé l'univers et l'homme avec un but. Mais quelle sorte de but? Dans la perspective Causa, ce but doit être un but bon.
The creation is like the artist expressing himself. The creation here on earth, our universe, is like an expression of God himself. So when God is essence is good, he can only express himself good, nothing else.
La création est comme l'œuvre d'un artiste qui essaie de s'exprimer. Donc,
manifestation of good. So God is good. Only good can be.
Si Dieu est bon, la création doit manifester la bonté de Dieu.
Furthermore, one other thing we always forget, very important. God is incapable of creating anything imperfect. Why? Because He is a perfection God. He is a perfected God. When He plans something, designs something, creates something, perfection can bear another perfection. So this universe and man must be meant by perfection.
Une autre chose que souvent nous oublions, c'est que Dieu est incapable de créer quelque chose qui n'est pas bon. quelque chose qui serait mauvaise. Parce que s'il pouvait faire cela, ça voudrait dire que cette création représente l'imperfection. Ça voudrait dire que Dieu aussi est imparfait.
That does not mean, we become a Superman. We can jump out of, Eiffel Tower and nobody gets hurt. That I don't mean perfection.
Cela ne veut pas dire qu'on doit être Superman, qu'on peut sauter de la tour Eiffel et sans faire aucun mal à nos corps. Quoi.
Here I'm talking about perfection in terms of being the man being a temple of God.
Quand je parle de la perfection, je parle dans le sens que l'homme doit arriver à être le temple de Dieu.
And when you read the 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 16, it says, do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwelling in you?
Par exemple, si nous prenons la Bible, nous lisons dans le livre des Corinthiens, ne savez-vous pas que vous êtes le temple de Dieu et que l'Esprit de Dieu demeure en vous?
The Bible is trying to describe man as a house of God. House, the temple of God.
La Bible essaie d'expliquer, d'écrire l'homme comme le temple de Dieu, la maison de Dieu.
So in other words, the perfection mean in Causa worldview, the spiritual union, total union with God, inseparable union between God and man. That is perfection, what we mean.
Dans la perspective Causa, quand nous parlons de la perfection, nous voulons dire l'union totale entre l'homme et Dieu.
Kind of state, Jesus said, believe me, that I am in the Father and the Father in me. Father and I are one. This kind of state. Everyone look at it, put yourself in that position. I'm in the Father, which is God, God in me, and the Father and I are one.
Quand nous prenons la Bible, nous trouvons là que Jésus dit « Croyez-moi que je suis dans le Père et que le Père est en moi. Le Père et moi, nous sommes un. » Essayez donc de penser un peu à ce que cela veut dire.
The original man is supposed to live with deity, the human level of living quality. At the same time, we are supposed to live another level, godlike quality, which was expressed in the Bible or in the life of Jesus.
Selon l'idéal, l'homme doit vivre comme un homme, mais aussi il doit avoir des qualités qui ressemblent à Dieu.
Yes. Today, we don't realize that godlike quality, except that we're reading in the Bible, in the life of Jesus. I will tell you a little later that because we've lost it. This is the human alienation. What Marx is talking about alienation is not so much economical alienation, but spiritual alienation.
Aujourd'hui, les hommes ont perdu ces qualités divines. Cela, c'est la vraie aliénation. Quand Marx parle de l'aliénation, mais la vraie aliénation, c'est la séparation entre l'homme et Dieu.
In other words, the Causa view that God intended to have every man and woman to be perfect, in perfect union with God, and create a society with that kind of perfected men and women, which is supposed to be ideal society, or, in a biblical term, kingdom of heaven on earth.
Autrement, ce qu'on veut dire ici, c'est que les hommes et les femmes, selon la volonté de Dieu, devaient atteindre la perfection. Et à travers cette perfection, ils devaient pouvoir réaliser une société idéale. Ils devaient atteindre la perfection, cela veut dire qu'ils devaient arriver à la maturité spirituelle.
The Tom slide, the Lord's Prayer, Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, it says, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
On a déjà vu ce matin le Notre Père, où l'on parle de la prière où Jésus dit que ton royaume vienne, que ta volonté soit sur la terre comme au ciel, soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel.
The important word here is on earth.
Ici, les paroles importantes sont sur la terre.
The problem of Christianity today and throughout history that other worldliness, they tend to abandon this world, trying to tend to longing my heaven up there somewhere. That has been a tendency.
Le problème dans le christianisme et dans les religions en général, est-ce qu'ils ont eu une tendance très transcendante, on peut dire, qu'ils ont ignoré les réalités d'ici, ils ont pensé d'un autre monde qui va venir après, et ils n'ont pas vu l'importance de ce qui se passe ici sur terre.
As soon as the God-believing people are abandoning this world and are trying to get on some kind of heaven upstairs, I tell you, we're going to lose to the communists, this entire world. Because they are after this world. This is their goal, and we are abandoning it. It's a lot easier for them to pick up when we're abandoned.
Je vous dis très franchement que si les croyants abandonnent cette terre, il est certain que les communistes vont gagner cette terre. Parce que ça, c'est leur but. Et il leur est beaucoup plus facile de gagner cette terre si nous, on l'abandonne pas.
The Causa worldview is saying, wait a minute. Who created this world? God created it. Without a clear purpose. Then, this is supposed to be the God world, the God society. Before we talk about heaven, we talk about God's ideal society on earth first. Let us grab our earth, grab our world, our society. We cannot abandon it in the name of God.
Dans la perspective de Causa, nous disons, attends un moment, qui est-ce qui a créé cette terre? Cette terre fut créée par Dieu. Donc cette terre appartient à Dieu, on ne peut pas l'abandonner. Nous voulons vraiment prendre cette terre, il faut gagner cette terre, ne pas la perdre au communisme, on doit la prendre, on doit gagner cette terre de cette menace.
These are the ideal or blueprint of original man. However, unfortunately, we are not living in that society. Contrary, we realize evil on earth.
Jusque maintenant, on a parlé des idéaux de l'homme, des idéaux de la création de Dieu. Mais malheureusement, aujourd'hui, on ne vit pas dans l'idéal.
The world evil. I'm not just talking about communism. Far before the Karl Marx ever came into a picture, there was a evil persisting in human history. That's what I'm talking about.
Le monde du mal. Je ne parle pas seulement ici du mal du communisme, parce que le mal a existé bien avant le communisme.
Corruption set in human heart.
La corruption s'est réalisée dans le cœur des hommes.
The corruption began from dishonesty.
La cause de la corruption, c'est la fausseté de l'homme.
Corruption began faithlessness. The man lack of faith in God.
À cause de son manque de foi en Dieu, la corruption a pu se développer chez l'homme.
I don't want to be too biblical, but when you read the Bible, Genesis, the one description is that the man was seduced, approached by the serpent. And the serpent gave a lie to men and women. And the men and women, instead of listening to God's commandment, they believed the lie. Here we see dishonesty and lack of faith. Two phenomena occur in the first chapter of the Bible.
Je ne veux pas être trop biblique, mais si on prend l'exemple de la Bible, nous savons que dans le livre de Genèse, on parle d'un premier homme et d'une première femme, et que eux, ils furent surpris par le serpent. Et si nous étudions ces récits, nous pouvons reconnaître qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, quelles sont les causes. D'abord, le serpent n'était pas honnête, et aussi, l'homme et la femme ont démontré un manque de foi. Donc, ces deux problèmes, le faute d'honnêteté et aussi le manque de foi chez l'homme.
What the result, what had occurred to humanity was the separation between God and man. The union has been broken. The separation occurred between God and man.
Le résultat de tout cela, c'est la séparation de l'homme et Dieu. C'est les conséquences de tout ce qui s'est passé, une séparation.
This separation brought the awful consequences. The first consequence is spiritual blindness.
Cette séparation a eu des conséquences affreuses, absolument affreuses.
We're blinded. We think we see everything. But I want you to understand that we are perceiving only the portion of God's creation, not total. This is a problem, because this is where selfishness coming in.
Le premier problème, c'est que l'homme est, ça c'est la première chose, spiritually blind, l'homme est arrivé à être aveugle spirituellement. Il ne peut pas voir la réalité. À cause de cette faute de perspective spirituellement, l'homme est arrivé à être aussi égoïste, centré sur lui seulement.
The selfishness and the man's desire to better himself must be understood separately.
Il y a deux choses qui sont complètement différentes et il faut séparer ces deux choses. Une chose, c'est l'égoïsme. L'autre chose, c'est le désir de chaque homme de s'améliorer. Ce sont deux choses séparées. Il faut reconnaître qu'il y a une différence profonde entre ces deux concepts.
The God gave man to desire to improve himself, the well-being of himself. This is a good quality, good character, God-given character. Nothing wrong with that.
C'est Dieu qui a donné à l'homme ce désir intrinsèque de s'améliorer, de faire mieux, d'améliorer son bien-être. Il n'y a rien de mauvais en tout cela. C'est une chose qui provient de Dieu.
But then that desire, because man being blinded spiritually, only apply narrowly. In a narrow application of that desire, bring in the poison of selfishness.
Mais parce que l'homme a ce manque de perspective, parce qu'il est aveugle spirituellement, il applique ce principe dans une façon très, pas très large, mais dans une façon trop simple, finalement, on peut dire, trop simplifiée.
So, we cannot conquer selfishness unless we bring in new awareness, or the total awareness of God's creation and total value perspective, as Mr. William Lay said. This is the first step. This is what the Causa is trying to accomplish.
Donc, on ne peut pas arriver à terminer l'égoïsme qui existe chez l'homme si on n'arrive pas justement à avoir une perspective totale des valeurs. Il faut absolument réaliser cette sorte de perspective si on va arrêter l'égoïsme.
We'll talk about that later, tomorrow, more about that.
On va parler plus à propos de ça.
But in this case, man is lived with a corrupted nature. We men have a two nature, mixed nature. We have good nature, no question. We have good feeling, good heart. But at the same time, evil nature. They work in it's manifested in so many evil crimes out there. So the man is lived under this kind of mixture of good and evil, corrupted nature.
Aujourd'hui, l'homme a une nature corrompue. Et l'homme, bien sûr, il y a un côté qui est bon chez l'homme, mais nous avons cette nature corrompue. D'un côté, nous voulons faire ce qui est bien, mais de l'autre côté, nous avons cette tendance de faire ce qui est mauvais. Cette division qui existe dans l'homme et parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous avons une nature corrompue.
This is how human history has started. Away from the original ideal or blueprint of God.
Il est dans cette façon que l'histoire humaine a commencé, loin du plan originel, des idéaux originels de Dieu.
It's an ideal and a reality gap have been formed.
Entre l'idéal et la réalité, il y a un décollage, on peut dire.
That is the true alienation.
Cela est la vraie aliénation.
We might call this society as a kingdom of hell on earth.
On peut peut-être appeler cette société le royaume de l'enfer sur la terre, sur terre.
Today, virtually, our human society is beset with so much war, crime, dishonesty, and there's already a hell And communism came in 1848, and perfected the human evil.
Aujourd'hui, nos sociétés ont tant de crimes, tant de malhonnêteté. C'est une réalité de la société. Et dans le XXe siècle, le communisme est parvenu pour vraiment perfectionner cette corruption, ces problèmes qui existent.
So I said this is a fair description. The communism worsened the situation and bring to the extreme and perfected the evil. This is what we are, what we have in our society.
Donc, je peux dire que le communisme a fait que les choses soient encore pires. Et à travers le communisme, vraiment, on a pu perfectionner le mal dans notre monde.
And our question is, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? What God is going to do?
Donc, notre question doit être, mais qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Qu'est-ce que c'est ce que Dieu va faire?
We ask that question now. Now what? Now we know the reality. We know the ideal. We know the reality. Now what? This is the question.
Eh bien, maintenant, il faut se poser la question. Bon, on connaît l'idéal, on connaît la réalité, mais après ça, qu'est-ce qui va se passer?
Where is our hope?
Où est notre espoir?
Where shall we turn to?
Où est-ce qu'il faut chercher?
God. Nowhere.
Il faut chercher Dieu.
So I can go on another hour on this subject alone, but I just quote one biblical sentence and then make a point and move on because of time.
Très facilement, je peux parler 1 heure à propos de cela, mais j'ai pas le temps. Donc, je vais juste citer une partie de la Bible et après, je vais aller à d'autres choses.
Isaiah 46, chapter 46 and verse 11, it said, I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do.
Isaïe, chapitre 46, le verset 11. J'ai parlé et je l'accomplirai. Je l'ai décidé et je le ferai.
This shows the determination of the Creator.
Cela nous démontre la détermination du Créateur.
He has spoken, ideal world.
Il a parlé d'un monde idéal.
He said he will bring it to pass.
Il a dit qu'il allait le réaliser.
He purposed the original world, not the random. He purposed it.
Il a déjà décidé un monde parfait.
God said, well, I'm going to try. I may be doing it. I'm thinking about it. He didn't say that.
Dieu n'a pas dit, bon, je vais essayer, je vais penser là-dessus. Non, il n'a pas dit ça.
He didn't say, I'm going to sleep on the question for several nights.
Il n'a pas dit, bon, je vais prendre cette question, je vais dormir quelques soirées, après je vais décider. Non, il n'a pas dit ça non plus.
I will do it.
Il a dit, je le ferai.
This is the human hope.
C'est l'espoir pour l'humanité.
So the work of God can be described in one sentence. Restoration.
Donc, on peut décrire le travail de Dieu dans un mot, finalement. La restauration.
Restoration. To bring the old, the dream come to truth. To bring the reality into original blueprint. Restore to that blueprint.
Terminer le décollage entre la réalité et l'idéal, le rêve de Dieu.
This restoration can be termed, another term would be recreation. Recreation.
Cette restauration, on peut l'appeler la récréation aussi. C'est un autre mot qui a le même sens.
Almost like mending a machine, the fixing a machine.
C'est presque comme on veut réparer une machine.
Not everything that God created went wrong, not at all.
Ce n'est pas qu'il n'y a rien qui marche, non, c'est pas du tout cela.
Nothing wrong with the stars and sun and the heavenly bodies, the planet Earth.
Il n'y a pas de problème avec les astres, avec la terre, avec le sol, c'est pas cela.
Nothing wrong with the trees and rivers and the land and oceans and the beautiful flowers.
Il n'y a pas de problème avec les arbres, avec les rivières, avec tous les éléments de la nature. C'est pas là le problème.
They are in an original form of creation. Period. Nothing wrong with that.
Ils existent toujours dans leur état originel de création.
The problem occurred in man.
Le problème existe chez l'homme. Le problème est arrivé d'abord chez l'homme.
Even in man, only one side of the man. Even physical aspect of man, biological aspect of man, is nothing wrong. God intended men just like this.
Il ne s'agit pas de tout l'homme, mais seulement une dimension de l'homme. Si on prend l'aspect biologique ou l'aspect physique de l'homme, l'homme est comme il doit être. Dieu avait fait le plan que l'homme soit comme il est.
Moving into heavenly society doesn't change Tom Word into a 300-pound man or 12 feet tall.
Dans le royaume des cieux, Tom Ward ne va pas peser 150 kilos, il ne va pas mesurer 4 mètres finalement.
He will just look as he looked handsome as he was here.
Il sera aussi laid qu'il est maintenant.
No problem. Nothing wrong with it physically, here. Nothing wrong.
Rien de mauvais physiquement ici.
The problem occurs internally.
Le problème, c'est un problème interne.
The blindness comes internally.
L'homme est aveugle, mais internement.
So God's intention to recreate that portion, bring it back, put it back, make it whole, that whole creation will become anew and perfection.
Donc, il est l'intention de Dieu de recréer cet aspect spirituel de l'homme, pour que l'homme soit entier, pour que l'homme puisse répondre à l'idéal originel de Dieu.
So, let's go back to Causa worldview on history. We reflect this idea in a general understanding to history.
Maintenant, on va parler de la perspective Causa de l'histoire.
That when God created, He already had a purpose preceded. We talk about the more this afternoon.
Quand Dieu a créé, il avait déjà un plan, un but.
Although the result has been departed from the original purpose, that purpose stayed. That is the goal.
Même si le résultat est différent de son plan originel, le but est toujours le même, quoi.
The human history, therefore, is running not on the class struggle, not on the historical materialism. Human history, whether you like it or not, God is steering, moving toward that original purpose, the realization of original purpose. So history has will and goal.
L'histoire n'agit pas à partir des principes matérialistes ou à partir de la dialectique. Ce qui est responsable pour la dynamique dans l'histoire, c'est ce procès pour arriver au but final de Dieu.
Today, so many people do not know where history is heading. And the karma picked up. Well, we can steer history. Man can mold history. Not so. They're already predestined goals. And will is steering toward that goal.
Il y a beaucoup d'hommes et femmes aujourd'hui qui ne comprennent pas le sens et les directions de l'histoire. Marx lui-même, il a pris cette situation pour dire, mais nous, on peut guider l'histoire, on peut décider le destinée de l'histoire. Mais ce n'est pas cela. L'histoire a déjà une destinée.
The history is running the history of restoration. Restoration is goal.
Le but de l'histoire, c'est la restauration.
Or another way of saying, history is going back, going original, blueprint of God. Original ideal, that is the goal.
L'histoire retourne à l'idéal originel de Dieu.
The problem is, man must play the role in history.
Mais le problème est que l'homme doit jouer un rôle dans le développement de l'histoire.
God picked man as a partner in restoration history. Man is partner of God. It's almost like a joint venture between God and man. This is really a problem. This is an honor as well as a problem, I tell you.
Dieu a choisi l'homme comme son partenaire dans ce procès de restauration. On peut dire que c'est un effort joint. C'est pas que Dieu peut le faire tout seul, mais il doit le faire avec l'homme. Et cela peut être un problème, et a été un problème beaucoup de fois dans l'histoire.
If God alone steered history, then there shall be no problem. Everything works like a clockwork. No question. Because God is almighty, omnipresent, omnipotent.
Si c'était uniquement Dieu qui guidait l'histoire, il n'y aurait pas de problème. Ça va marcher parfaitement. Il n'y aurait aucun problème si c'était vraiment Dieu qui guidait l'histoire.
The joint venture is structured, then, even though one partner is fulfilling the entire responsibility, the other partner fails the responsibility, total consequence would be the failure.
Mais parce que c'est un effort de collaboration, un effort joint, ce n'est pas possible, parce que même s'il y a un partenaire qui travaille très fort, qui fait un effort incroyable pour accomplir ses tâches, mais si l'autre ne fait rien, on ne peut pas arriver au but finalement, s'il faut absolument une collaboration.
This is a very important part of Causa worldview. That is that God is not failing. The history has been failing by men. Men have not been doing men's role. So even if God has done his entire role, as long as men supply his own responsibility, total human history cannot make a progress so fast.
C'est une partie très importante de la perspective Causa. Parce que ce que cela veut dire, ce que cela indique, c'est que si l'homme ne peut pas réaliser sa partie de responsabilité, Dieu ne peut pas accomplir sa volonté. En dépit de tous ses efforts, il a besoin de l'homme, dans la perspective de Causa, une collaboration pour réaliser sa volonté sur cette terre.
That human responsibility is faith and obedience in God. This is it.
La responsabilité de l'homme, c'est avoir foi en Dieu, et aussi il faut obéir à Dieu.
God demands, God needs human response in faith. Without this response in faith, the human history cannot accomplish, cannot move forward.
Dieu demande, même on peut dire Dieu exige, Dieu a besoin d'une réponse de la part de l'homme. Sans cela, Dieu ne peut pas aller en avance.
History will prolong, postpone. The program keeps postponing.
Autrement, il y aura des prolongations, on ne peut pas arriver au but.
For example, look at the exodus of Israel people, chosen people from Egypt.
Prenons par exemple l'exode des Israélites.
God has a program and a will to bring out the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan, land of Canaan.
Dieu avait une volonté et un plan pour que les Israélites pouvaient sortir d'Égypte.
You look at the map from the Egypt to Israel, land of Canaan, probably even on foot, 40 days would be more than sufficient.
Si vous regardez par exemple un plan et vous voyez la distance entre l'Égypte et l'Israël, probablement peut-être 40 jours seraient suffisants pour y aller même à pied.
If this program needs to be fulfilled, God's will to be fulfilled, men, Moses, down everybody, need to have a faith in God and obedience to God.
Pour que la volonté de Dieu soit réalisée dans ce cas-là, il était important, essentiel que Moïse et tous les Israélites gardent leur foi en Dieu.
But what happened? Even after seeing the miracle, the Red Sea, chopped into two parts, people saw those miracles in their own eyes, but they still doubt God, still disobedient to God, still complain, and still create idols to worship. What happened? 40 days prolonged 40 years.
Mais qu'est-ce qui se passait? Si nous étudions la Bible, nous voyons que même après les miracles, après tous les signes de Dieu, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Même après que Dieu a ouvert le mer Rouge et tout, à cause de le manque de leur foi, Dieu n'a pas pu travailler, il n'a pas pu réaliser cela, et il ne s'agissait pas donc de 40 jours, mais finalement de 40 années.
The union between God and man was not there. The cooperation was not there.
L'union entre Dieu et l'homme n'y était pas. La coopération n'existait pas.
That particular program, because of failure of man, has been prolonged.
À cause de cet échec, à cause de ce manque de coopération, Dieu a dû prolonger.
The faithlessness of the Israelites is so severe, incredible. Even God punished them. All those left from Egypt died in the wilderness. Only the second generation, led by the Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses could not enter into Canaan. Only Joshua and Caleb entered into Canaan, only with the second generation.
Le manque de foi était si grand que Dieu a dû punir les Israélites finalement. Et toute cette génération qui est partie d'Égypte, entre ces personnes, seulement Josué et Caleb ont pu entrer en Israël. Tous les autres sont morts dans le désert.
Today, this very thing is happening. We cannot just sit back. Well, God will take care of everything. This will be the worst problem We free world face it today.
Aujourd'hui, on doit apprendre de cette personne, finalement, nous-mêmes. On ne peut pas penser, bon, nous dans le monde libre, on ne doit pas se préoccuper des situations, des conditions qui existent aujourd'hui. Dieu va s'occuper de tout. On peut pas avoir cette attitude.
God has a will, definite will for Paris, for France, for the United States, for England, for Germany, for Korea. Today, nowadays.
Dieu a sûrement une volonté pour Paris, pour l'Allemagne, pour l'Angleterre, pour la Corée.
And God did not want us to appease with communism.
Et Dieu ne veut pas que nous faisions des apaisements, que nous collaborions avec les communistes.
And God wants us to understand clearly His will of the 20th century, and He wants us to take the leading role. It's all like a cinema, movie. He wants us to become the leading star, men and women.
Et ce que Dieu veut que nous fassions aujourd'hui, c'est que nous prenons vraiment cette position de leader dans cette lutte. Il veut que nous soyons sur cette scène aujourd'hui, cette bataille contre le communisme, que nous soyons vraiment les astres de cette lutte, les stars, on peut dire, de cette lutte.
In other words, Causa is saying, men must understand the principles and will of God. Men must take the initiative to will to be realized.
Ce que nous disons ici avec Causa, c'est que c'est la responsabilité de l'homme de prendre l'initiative, de comprendre la volonté de Dieu et d'agir à partir d'entendre cela.
Man is in a way everything. This is why God is taking a step back, almost like a coach role. The man is the player. Unless we play the game, no victory of God will come.
C'est comme Dieu veut que nous prenions cette position d'agir. Dans un sens, Dieu veut reculer un peu pour voir ce que les hommes vont faire. Dans un sens, nous sommes les joueurs et Dieu est comme le coach finalement.
Let me close with the one anecdote, one story. Even those people who believe in God, they believe in such passive way. Well, let God do everything. Let Him do everything. Let me sit back and just have a faith in God. That is not enough. We must act faith. We must act indeed.
Je vais terminer avec une anecdote. Il y a des gens qui pensent, bon, moi je vais me mettre là, c'est Dieu qui doit agir, je peux rien faire, je tombe là, quoi.
The one village, there was a flood came.
Dans une ville, dans une commune, on peut dire, il y avait...
Everybody, to survive, they went up to the roof and asking, shouting for help.
Il y avait des inondations. Il y avait des inondations dans une commune. Et pour s'échapper de cette situation, tout le monde s'est mis sur les toits.
And boat is going around, picking out everybody from the roof. Boat is going around.
Un bateau est venu pour chercher des personnes assises sur les toits.
There's one man keeps saying, don't worry about me. I have a faith in God. Don't come to me. I'll be all right.
Mais parmi ces personnes, il y avait un monsieur qui disait, ne vous occupez pas de moi, moi je suis bien, j'ai foi en Dieu, j'ai pas besoin de votre bateau.
But he was remaining on the roof alone.
Il est resté finalement tout seul sur le
Water
toit.
getting swelling up.
Mais l'eau a continué à monter de plus en plus.
Water come to this level.
Finalement, l'eau est arrivée à son point.
Everybody saying that this is the final chance. You come on the boat. He refused.
Tout le monde lui a dit, mais c'est ta chance finale, viens vite.
Finally, helicopter came.
Après ça, un hélicoptère est venu.
Bring down the basket so that man can ride on.
Et ils ont descendu un panier, il faut le chercher.
But the man said, don't worry about me. I have a faith in God. He will take care of me.
Et il a dit, ne vous en occupez pas de moi, je vais très bien, Dieu va s'occuper de moi.
He refused.
Encore une fois, il a refusé.
5 minutes later, he was drowned to death.
5 minutes après, le pauvre type est mort.
So he went up to the spirit world.
Et il est allé dans notre monde.
He didn't understand.
Il ne comprenait pas.
He went to God.
Il est allé devant Dieu.
Protested.
Et il a commencé à protester.
Mr. God, what happened to you?
Monsieur Dieu, mais qu'est-ce qui est arrivé
You know
pour
what?
moi?
I have a faith in you.
J'avais,
I believed all my life.
je croyais en toi. Tu m'as
I went to church every Sunday.
J'allais toujours à l'église.
Why did you save me?
Pourquoi tu m'as pas sauvé?
God said to him, my boy, what else can I do? I sent your boat. I sent the helicopters. What else can I do, my boy?
Il lui a dit, mais mon brave, qu'est-ce que tu veux que je fasse? Je t'ai envoyé un bateau, je t'ai envoyé un hélicoptère, que plus que je fais?
I said this to you. Today is precisely the day that we not only understand the will of God, we must act. The man grows.
Aujourd'hui, c'est un moment où l'on ne doit pas seulement comprendre la volonté de Dieu, mais aussi il faut agir.
Without man's participation, will of God cannot be fulfilled.
Sans la participation de l'homme, la volonté de Dieu ne peut pas se réaliser.
Furthermore, history of struggle, communism say class struggle. We Causa say between good and evil. Struggle between good and evil.
Le communisme dit que l'histoire c'est une histoire de lutte des classes, mais dans la perspective Causa, nous disons que c'est une lutte entre le bien et le mal.
The struggle is not necessarily bring progress, but the struggle come into being because evil has been introduced to the world, not so much classes.
La lutte ne peut pas forcément être responsable pour le progrès. La lutte existe parce que le mal existe.
So the role is to assist God's will to make the good power, good group and a good will to be victorious, and evil shall be liquidated. By doing so, the true genuine progress will come in cooperation.
Il est la responsabilité de l'homme d'aider Dieu pour que sa volonté soit réalisée sur cette terre, pour que la volonté de Dieu soit réalisée et pour que le mal soit arrêté.
In conclusion, the root cause of man is separation from God and fellow men.
Pour conclure, la cause fondamentale du mal était la séparation de Dieu et la séparation qui existe entre Dieu et les autres hommes.
This is one thing we agree with Karl Marx. Alienation occurred.
Il y a une chose que nous acceptons des enseignements de Marx, que l'aliénation est arrivée,
But
existe.
diagnosis is entirely different. It's not the materialistic alienation, economic alienation. It is the more fundamental spiritual alienation of man from God.
Mais nous n'acceptons pas qu'il s'agit d'une aliénation uniquement matérielle. Il s'agit d'une aliénation spirituelle, séparation de Dieu.
The answer, therefore, lies in the union with God and fellow men.
Finalement, la solution se trouve finalement à travers l'union entre Dieu et tous les hommes.
We use the word as fellow man, which is indicating that without uniting with God, the fellow man cannot become one.
Nous parlons des hommes parce que nous voulons indiquer que sans unité avec Dieu, il est impossible de voir unité entre les hommes.
How can Tom and I become a brother?
Comment sera-t-il possible que le colonel Park et moi, on peut arriver à être des frères?
Holding close like it doesn't make me brother.
Seulement si je le tiens très fort comme ça ne veut pas dire que je suis son frère.
Only one moment we become a brother, when both of us recognize one common parent above us.
Il y a seulement une façon qui est possible. C'est si ensemble nous reconnaissons que nous avons un même parent.
So the role, history, and is the restoration.
Donc l'histoire est une histoire de restauration.
This is the hope. And we elaborate this more in the next several hours today and tomorrow.